July 1st, 1838 begins with heat and dust over Crawford County, Arkansas, as an enslaved boy named Bass Reeves is born on land owned by William Steele Reeves, his first breath taken in a cabin where every board and tool belongs to someone else. The small structure sits close to the main house and fields, its rough timbers marked by years of weather, its single doorway opening toward rows of crops that tie every enslaved person on the place to the will of the man whose name they carry without choice. Inside that cramped room, the air holds the mixed smells of sweat, smoke, and old cloth, and the sounds of other families move through thin walls while the new child cries. His mother has already spent years under orders, and the older women around her know that a newborn on a plantation is counted more as added labor than as a separate future. Yet they still pass the child carefully from arm to arm, speak his name, and try to give him small comforts that cannot be taken as easily as tools or food. The child will never forget these women, even if individual faces blur behind the constant fatigue of the years ahead. Crawford County in the 1830s is a place where wagons creak along narrow roads, where the Arkansas River carries both trade and rumor, and where slavery forms part of the ordinary landscape. Trees edge the fields and distant hills, but for the people working under compulsion, the most noticeable feature is the long stretch of ground they must cross again and again. Sun and frost decide the pace of the day, and overseers enforce that pace with eyes and whips. Children watch from the edges until they are old enough to be pulled into the same routines. As Bass grows past the helpless stage of infancy, there is no gentle childhood waiting. By the time he can walk firmly, hands reach for him with tasks. He is first asked to carry water, gather kindling, and shoo birds from rows of corn. And very quickly those small errands become the beginning of a working life. Each step away from the cabin teaches him a little more about the distances across the property, the shortcuts through brush, and the sounds that travel before a rider comes into view. The boy learns to stay alert not only to commands shouted from the main house or the fields, but also to the quieter signals that matter just as much. The way a door closes can tell him whether an argument has ended or is only pausing. Hoofbeats on the packed earth outside the quarters can hint at whether an overseer is riding alone or with another white man whose temper he does not yet know. Every pattern becomes a kind of map in his mind, and that constant attention to detail, forced on him by the need to avoid sudden punishment, begins to sharpen skills that will later guide him across hundreds of miles on the frontier. Other enslaved adults notice that Bass watches more than he talks. He studies how tools are repaired, how older men handle teams of horses or mules, and how quick hands can turn a small rest into motion again when someone approaches. Around the hearth at night, he listens to stories about relatives sold away, about distant places where the work is different, and about small acts of resistance that give people some sense of control. Those stories teach him that authority is not always as firm as it appears, that there are weak points in the way power operates, even in a system that seems to decide every detail of his day. The name Bass ties him to his grandfather, Bass Washington, a man whose own experiences with bondage and survival echo through family conversations. When older relatives talk about the past, they describe long days that look very much like the present ones, but they also mention brief moments when someone resisted or escaped. The young boy hears these accounts without smiles or applause, aware that every such attempt carries risk, yet the very fact that people have run and sometimes disappeared successfully plants a steady idea that there are distances beyond any property line. In 1846, when Bass is still a child, the Reeves family uproots from Arkansas and moves west to Grayson County, Texas, near the growing settlement of Sherman in the Peters Colony. Wagons roll along long traces, and enslaved families travel with whatever small bundles they are allowed to keep, watching the old landscape fall behind. For the white family, the move promises fresh land and new opportunity. For those forced to go with them, it simply means that every familiar tree and hidden path they had learned in Arkansas loses its value as a guide. The new plantation near the Red River sits in a region where the frontier is still forming its own order. Grayson County has scattered farms and ranches, a small number of enslaved people in proportion to the total population, and a mix of newcomers from several southern states. Fields reach toward creek bottoms and patches of woods break the horizon. Winters can bring biting wind that cuts across open ground, while summers press heat down on every chore. The work does not change simply because the county name is different. Men and women still rise before full daylight to prepare fires, feed animals, and step into rows of crops. On this Texas land, Bass is assigned more often to chores that involve animals and equipment rather than only hoeing in the fields. He works as a stable hand, learning the temperament of each horse and mule, how to calm a skittish animal, and how to tighten harness so that wagons hold together on rough tracks. He sweeps stalls, carries feed, and checks hooves for stones, gaining the kind of close familiarity that allows him to notice a limp before others do. That skill later translates into an ability to read any sign left in dust or mud. But at this stage, it is simply another requirement to keep his owners satisfied. Alongside the stable work, Bass spends time in and around a blacksmith's area where metal clanks and sparks fly as tools are shaped and repaired. As an apprentice, he works the bellows, holds pieces steady on the anvil, and positions iron for shoeing animals. The heat from the forge presses into his skin, and the weight of hammers and tongs hardens his arms and shoulders. The routine harshness of this environment with its hot iron and sharp edges would make many people move carefully. Yet he learns to stand firm near blows that could injure him if he flinched at the wrong moment. This combination of stable duties and blacksmith work builds a body that can handle long hours in the saddle and quick movements on foot. It also gives the young man a practical understanding of how metal, leather, and wood function together under strain. When he later evaluates a firearm, a wagon, or a pair of shackles, he already knows from experience where weak points may appear. The skill is not glamorous, but it grows silently with every day he spends catching a colt, lifting a wagon tongue, or turning a stubborn bolt under orders. The social environment on the Texas plantation differs from Arkansas mainly in the sense that the wider frontier feels closer. News reaches the quarters about conflicts with native nations, about trails heading further west, and about men who have left established counties to seek their fortune elsewhere. Some white settlers talk openly about politics and expansion, while others speak more quietly about raids, robberies, and killings along remote roads. Enslaved people hear fragments of these conversations and exchange them after dark, knowing that any unrest in the territory could make their own lives either harsher or, in some cases, less controlled at the edges. Bass absorbs the names of rivers, crossings, and settlements as he hears them. Red River, Preston, Sherman, and distant Indian Territory become more than lines and stories told after work. They are places that appear in accounts about men who have vanished, trails that carry cattle, and regions where law looks thin. The boy never holds a paper map in his hands, yet his mind accumulates a detailed sense of direction. He can picture where the river bends, where a certain stand of trees marks a fork in the road, and where low ground may flood after heavy rain. Personal danger remains constant throughout his youth. An overseer's temper, a perceived slight, or an accusation of laziness can bring blows or worse. Bass sees other enslaved men and women punished, some for reasons explained loudly and some without explanation at all. These events leave marks not only on the people beaten but also on every witness. The young man learns to keep his expression steady and his posture respectful when violence erupts nearby, because any sign of reaction could draw attention. At the same time, his memory holds on to the exact circumstances that lead to each beating, reinforcing his sense that behavior and consequence are linked in ways he must understand clearly. Religious gatherings offer one of the few organized spaces where enslaved families can gather with some measure of shared purpose. Under supervision or in secluded clearings, they sing, pray, and speak about deliverance that may come in this world or the next. Bass listens more than he participates, noting the way elders use full names when they mention someone in prayer, the way they recount small mercies, and the way they refer to freedom in coded language. These meetings strengthen ties among families and remind him that many people see his life as part of a longer story that stretches beyond one plantation or county. In the quarters themselves, evenings bring quieter moments when men repair shoes and tools, while women mend clothing and tend to children. Bass sits near hearths where simple meals simmer and smoke drifts upward, hearing the small talk that grows around shared labor. People comment on weather patterns, on the health of livestock, and on rumors about possible sales or moves. In these exchanges, he notices who speaks with more insight about the owner's finances or about distant markets, and he correlates that knowledge with actual events as they unfold, sharpening an instinct for sorting solid information from mere talk. At some point during his teenage years, Bass comes under more direct authority of George Reeves, the son of William Steele Reeves. George holds local standing as a sheriff, legislator, and later as a Confederate officer. For Bass, this shift means that his work ties even more closely to one man's expectations and moods. He serves as personal attendant, handling horses, traveling alongside George, and often staying close during visits to neighboring estates. This constant proximity forces Bass to monitor not just general plantation patterns, but also the specific habits of a single individual whose favor or anger can change his daily conditions. Riding with George exposes Bass to a broader view of the county. He sees court sessions, trading posts, and gatherings where white men discuss elections and laws. The words themselves sometimes blur, especially when legal terms fill a room. But he pays attention to who holds authority and how that authority is exercised. He watches as disputes move from argument to formal decision, and he observes which men carry themselves with quiet confidence versus loud bluster. These observations will later help him read suspects and witnesses, yet at this stage he remains outwardly silent, an enslaved attendant standing near the wall. Firearms become a more regular presence in his daily life during these years. George, like many men of his class, keeps pistols and long guns at hand for hunting, personal defense, and display. Bass learns to clean and maintain these weapons, running cloth through barrels, checking springs, and reassembling locks with care. He notices how different guns balance in the hand, how weight shifts with length and caliber, and how slight deformities in a barrel or cylinder can affect function. Even when he is not the one pulling the trigger, his fingers memorize the feel of metal and wood joined for rapid use. Occasional supervised hunting trips give Bass rare moments when his attention moves beyond labor and immediate survival. Tracking game through wooded areas near the Red River, he studies how animal tracks imprint in soft ground, how broken twigs show direction, and how faint trails weave between thicker stands of vegetation. The same patience needed to stalk a deer or turkey also applies to following a rider across dry country, and he begins to understand how long a scent or mark can last under different conditions. The skills are practical, part of the work expected of him. Yet they also hint at a wider range of possibilities in a region where many disputes are settled by who can find whom. As the 1850s progress, tension across the United States increases. Conversations among white planters and merchants include more references to national politics, to the balance between free and slave states, and to the growing talk of secession. Bass does not sit at tables where such matters are debated, but he hears names, dates, and locations repeated with urgency, and he notices when letters or newspapers produce sharp reactions. Each new development seems at first to have little direct impact on his daily chores, yet there is a gradual sense that large forces are moving beyond the fields, and that those forces may someday reach even Grayson County. Through all of these changes, one fact remains constant for Bass. His body and time belong legally to others, and every decision he makes must account for that reality. Yet within those constraints, he quietly collects knowledge about terrain, human behavior, animals, tools, and weapons. He builds physical endurance through unending work and emotional control through constant exposure to sudden anger or fear. No single event in these early years stands out as a dramatic turning point, but the steady accumulation of experience shapes a young man who will later ride across thousands of miles without losing his way or his nerve. By the time war looms and the familiar routines of the plantation begin to shift toward military preparation, Bass Reeves is no longer a small child in the quarters. He has grown into a tall, strong young man whose movements carry the confidence of someone used to handling horses and heavy equipment. He understands how to stay inconspicuous when necessary, and how to step forward when a task requires his skill. Around him, other enslaved people sense that he has become one of the dependable figures in their community, someone who can guide, fix, or carry almost anything. This early life in Arkansas and Texas does not yet involve badges, official warrants, or the authority of a federal court. It does, however, create the conditions that will later allow Bass Reeves to operate in one of the most demanding law enforcement roles on the frontier. Every lesson learned under bondage, every mile walked behind a plow or beside a wagon, and every quiet evening spent absorbing fragments of conversation adds another layer to his understanding of how people and places interact. When his path eventually leads toward open conflict with armed outlaws, the discipline formed in these years will stand behind every decision he makes in the saddle and on foot. January 1, 1862, finds Bass Reeves still attached to George Reeves near the Red River, with Confederate units drilling and marching while enslaved attendants handle the endless chores that keep the camp running. Tents and rough shelters line a patch of ground that was once only pasture, now marked by stacked firewood, feed sacks, and equipment racks. Wagons stand in a loose row, wheels sunk slightly into the damp soil where recent rain has softened the surface, and picket lines hold horses that shift and snort whenever bugles sound. For an enslaved man who has spent years on plantation land, the noise and movement of a military camp create a different kind of confinement, one controlled by officers as well as masters. The war has changed the rhythm of Bass Reeves's days. Instead of only plantation routines, he now rises before most soldiers, checking animals, filling water buckets, and making sure saddles, bridles, and harnesses lie ready for inspection. George Reeves relies on him as a body servant and handler of stock, often calling him into the tent to fetch items, prepare clothing, and manage personal gear. Bass hears men talk about campaigns and politics in tones that swing between excitement and worry, but his own focus stays on the tasks that must be completed before accusations of neglect begin. The proximity to officers and weapons gives him a wider view of events than most enslaved field hands ever receive, even as it reinforces how little control he holds over his own direction. Confederate camp life along the Red River sits close to the shifting frontier. Thunderstorms can sweep in with little warning, turning parade grounds into slick patches of mud. Cold fronts drop temperatures sharply at night, and men huddle near campfires whose smoke stings the eyes. Supply wagons arrive irregularly, sometimes bringing full loads of food and ammunition, sometimes only partial shipments that deepen the grumbling in the ranks. Enslaved workers like Bass absorb the brunt of that frustration when equipment goes missing or meals fall short. because officers and enlisted men alike look for someone to blame when their comfort or readiness suffers. The longer the war continues, the more often card games appear as a way for soldiers to pass time between drills. In corners of the camp, under lantern light or moonlight, men sit on crates or overturned buckets, coins and small valuables scattered on makeshift tables or blankets. Bass moves through these spaces on errands or while carrying gear, and he cannot avoid noticing who wins, who loses, and who handles defeat poorly. He understands that temper and pride can flare quickly around gambling, especially when the outcome challenges a man's reputation in front of his peers. George Reeves participates in these games, confident in his status and accustomed to deference from others. Family accounts from later years describe a particular evening when tempers in one of these gatherings rise higher than usual. The deck passes from hand to hand, and comments about luck sharpen into accusations about card handling. Bass stands close enough to hear sharp words between George and another player, then finds himself drawn into the argument when someone suggests the enslaved attendant had played a role in the way the cards were shuffled or delivered. Whether the dispute centers on that single accusation or broader resentments that have been building is less important than the fact that voices rise and fists clench in a tightly packed circle of men already under strain. The confrontation escalates beyond the usual rough joking that surrounds camp games. In this charged moment, Bass Reeves reacts in a way that breaks the rules that have shaped his entire life under bondage. Later recollections from his family speak of a blow struck against George Reeves, enough to knock the older man back and shock onlookers who never expected an enslaved man to lay hands on his owner. The instant that follows is brutally clear in Bass's mind. All of the unspoken calculations that have guided his behavior for years, all of the caution that kept him alive, collapse into the recognition that his situation has changed in a single motion. He does not wait to see how George will respond once he recovers from surprise. Bass knows that striking a white employer in wartime Confederate Texas invites not only whipping or sale, but near certain death, especially when the man holds public standing and military rank. Staying in camp means waiting for punishment that will arrive with full approval of officers and enlisted men. The only path that holds any chance of survival lies away from the tents, beyond the lines of pickets and sentries, and across the region that white soldiers call Indian Territory. That region sits just to the north, separated by the Red River, and Bass has carried its name in his memory since he first heard local men speak of it years earlier. Night offers his best chance to move without immediate pursuit. On a dark, windless evening, while the camp settles around fires and low voices, he gathers only what he can carry without attracting attention. A blanket, a small amount of food, and a container for water become his entire kit. He avoids taking any weapon that soldiers will miss quickly because a stolen gun or knife can prompt a pointed search. Instead, he relies on his knowledge of horse behavior and human patterns gained on plantations and in the camp. He chooses a moment when guards grow bored, when men near the picket line talk more than they watch, and slips into deeper shadow beyond the last circle of light. The walk to the river is not a straight march away from camp. Bass moves in stages, pausing whenever he hears raised voices or senses movement nearby. He uses tree lines, low swales, and patches of brush to break his outline, knowing that even a fleeting silhouette can draw a shot from a nervous sentry. Every sound reaches his ears, with exaggerated clarity, from the distant call of owls to the crunch of his own footsteps in dry leaves. Years of moving carefully around overseers and armed planters have shown him how to distribute his weight on uneven ground. And now that skill carries him forward more quietly than many men realize is possible. When he reaches the Red River, its broad channel forms both barrier and promise. The water level shifts with weather, sometimes low enough to expose gravel bars, sometimes high and fast. On this night, the current runs firm but not extreme, and the opposite bank looms as a darker line against the sky. Bass knows he cannot remain long on the near bank. Riders from camp could trace his path along obvious trails if they realize his absence quickly. He wades into the shallows, feeling cold water soak his trousers, then begins a slow, deliberate crossing that keeps his head barely above the surface when the river deepens. Each step risks a stumble that could send him under, but he keeps his grip on the small bundle of possessions and pushes toward the far side. Climbing onto the northern bank, soaked and breathing hard, he stands in territory that Confederate officers do not control in the same direct way as plantation land. Indian Territory holds its own webs of authority, divided among several native nations that have signed complex treaties and taken different positions in the war. Some groups lean toward the Confederacy, others toward the Union, and many families simply try to protect their own people and land from two rival governments that both claim power. For a fugitive who has just struck his enslaver, every settlement represents both opportunity and danger. The first people Bass encounters in this region speak a mixture of languages, with bits of English threaded through. Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole families maintain farm plots and small villages along trails and waterways. Buildings range from log houses to cabins and more traditional structures, with livestock penned nearby and smoke rising from cook fires. Strangers are evaluated with direct stares, and weapons remain close at hand even when greetings sound civil. Reeves quickly understands that he must present himself not as a drifting laborer with nothing to offer, but as someone whose skills can help a community already burdened by war. He introduces himself as a man fleeing bondage and Confederate service, careful not to display arrogance or desperation. His experience with horses, firearms, and field labor gives him practical value, and he demonstrates this quietly rather than through grand claims. When asked to help with stock, he moves confidently among animals, checking hooves and harness. When invited to handle a rifle or musket, he shows safe familiarity, loading and unloading without fumbling. These actions speak more clearly to potential hosts than any long speech might, and they begin to shift him in their eyes from unknown risk to possible ally. As he spends more time among Creek and Seminole communities, Bass works to pick up spoken patterns as diligently as he once learned every sound on plantations and in military camp. He starts with basic words connected to food, shelter, and directions, repeating them internally until they stick. Over weeks and months, this vocabulary expands into short phrases and questions. Children often prove more patient teachers than adults, correcting his pronunciation with straightforward bluntness that does not carry the same edge as criticism from elders. The more he understands, the more he can grasp not just orders or requests, but also the tone of conversations around him. In these settlements, daily life remains demanding despite the relative distance from major fronts. Men and older boys leave to join units aligned with either Confederate or Union forces, or they ride in local defense companies that protect communities from raids. Women manage households, crops, and livestock while also preparing supplies for fighters. Refugees from other regions pass through with stories of burned homesteads and seized property. Bass listens, absorbing details about routes, alliances, and ongoing skirmishes, gradually forming a mental picture of how power operates in this territory. The complex mosaic of loyalties fascinates him because it differs from the more rigid lines that defined plantation society in Texas. Some accounts from regional historians describe Bass Reeves serving with Union Indian Home Guard regiments, units made up largely of native soldiers who support the federal government against Confederate forces. Whether as a formal member or as a scout attached to such companies, his practical role centers on guiding men through terrain he has begun to understand intimately. He knows which creeks rise fastest after storms, which ridges offer broad views without exposing troops too clearly, and which byways allow a small group to approach a target without calling attention from main roads. That knowledge, gained through months of moving carefully across the land, becomes a currency that buys him security among warriors who value results. Tracking skills that began with animals now expand to human movement. Bass studies the prints left by different kinds of footwear, the depth of impressions that signal the speed and load of a traveler, and the way bent grass or broken twigs can mark a hurried passage even on firm ground. He practices estimating how many hours have passed since someone crossed a particular point by comparing the sharpness of edges and the dryness of disturbed soil. When others in a scouting party point to ambiguous signs, he offers clear interpretations only when certain, because he knows that a wrong guess can lead men into an ambush or allow an enemy column to slip away. Firearms practice also becomes more focused during this period. Away from the rigid hierarchies of plantation and Confederate camp, Bass has greater freedom to handle weapons regularly. Stories later told about him mention turkey shooting contests where shooters aim at small targets on posts from notable distances, with strict rules about accuracy. According to those accounts, Reeves's performance grows so consistent that organizers decide he cannot compete, fearing he will take prizes too easily. The underlying truth beyond embellishment is that he spends significant time honing his aim under varied conditions, firing from standing, kneeling, and prone positions, and learning how light, wind, and fatigue affect his shots. The war around him continues with uneven intensity. Battles flare in some sectors while long stretches of uncertainty grip others. Supply shortages, disease, and shifting alliances strain every community in Indian Territory. Bass sees how quickly fortunes can change when a unit loses key leaders or when a treaty collapses. He also witnesses the resilience of families who rebuild shelters after raids and replant fields even when future harvests remain at risk. Observing these responses deepens his understanding that survival on this frontier depends on adaptability as much as on courage. For all the practical duties he performs, Bass does not forget that he remains a fugitive in the eyes of his former enslaver and Confederate authorities. He hears occasional rumors of patrols searching for runaways, and he knows that rewards may be posted for his capture. To reduce that risk, he avoids lingering near major crossings where traders and soldiers pass frequently. He favors back routes, small fords, and wooded stretches that allow him to disappear quickly if someone asks too many questions. In conversations with new acquaintances, he shares enough of his story to explain his presence, but rarely gives detailed accounts of the conflict that led him to flee, because specific names and dates could circulate back toward Texas. Over time, Reeves's position in these native communities shifts from transient guest to familiar figure. He participates in seasonal work cycles, helps round up stray livestock after storms, and contributes to building or repairing structures. He offers his growing language skills to bridge communication gaps with English-speaking officials or traders when necessary, and he gains the trust that comes from showing up reliably for demanding tasks. Children greet him without hesitation, and elders call on him for assistance without treating him as an outsider. The constant edge of fear that marked his early days in the territory softens into a more stable sense of belonging, although he never confuses this relative safety with permanent security. The end of the Civil War brings new uncertainties for everyone in the region. News of Confederate defeat and the formal end of slavery filters into Indian Territory through messengers, newspapers, and returning soldiers. Treaties must be renegotiated, and new federal policies promise both opportunities and threats to native nations that had aligned with either side. For Bass Reeves, the legal change means that, in theory, he no longer counts as property under any law. Yet he understands that attitudes do not shift overnight and that men who once claimed ownership of him may still resent his escape. In the months following the war, Bass considers his choices carefully. Remaining in Indian Territory would keep him close to communities that have sheltered and employed him, but it could also limit his prospects in a region where political and economic arrangements are still in flux. Moving back toward the Arkansas border, on the other hand, could let him establish an independent household under new federal protections while staying near the land he has learned to read so well. The decision weighs heavily, because it will determine not only his own path but the conditions under which any future family of his would live. By choosing eventually to settle near Van Buren on the Arkansas side of the river, Reeves does not sever ties with Indian Territory. He carries with him the languages he has learned, the detailed mental maps he has built, and the relationships he has formed with people who know the territory's hidden roots and power structures. The years spent as a fugitive and scout have transformed him from a plantation-bound laborer into a free man with frontier experience that few others can match. That combination of personal history and practical knowledge will soon make him valuable to a federal court that struggles to enforce law across one of the most violent regions in the post-war United States. December 6, 1865, marks the day when the 13th Amendment becomes part of United States law, abolishing slavery while Bass Reeves lives as a free man near Van Buren, Arkansas, already shaping a new existence that depends on his own judgment instead of an owner's commands. The change in national law confirms what his own actions during the war have already secured in practice, yet it also signals that the struggles ahead will take place under a different set of rules, with courts and officials replacing plantation overseers as the main forces that decide where he can move and how he can work. The land he has chosen near Van Buren lies along the rolling ground that drops toward the Arkansas River. Small fields of corn, sorghum, and vegetables break up stretches of grass and scattered trees. Simple fences of split rails or rough posts mark property lines, though storms and roaming livestock often knock down sections that must be rebuilt. Reeves rises before first light to check animals, examine the sky, and judge whether the day should be spent plowing, mending fences, or hauling goods to town. Farming does not spare him labor after the punishing years of bondage, but the knowledge that he works for his own household rather than for someone else's ledger gives each chore a different weight. He marries Nellie Jenny, a Texas-born woman with her own history of survival, and together they establish a household that grows crowded with children. Records from later years list 10 sons and daughters from this marriage. The house that shelters them is not large, but it stands on land-based names and pays for himself. Inside, the voices that fill the space belong to people who share his last name by choice rather than compulsion. Even when money grows tight and harvest falls short, that difference matters more to him than any fine furnishings could. Van Buren during Reconstruction sits at a crossroads between older Southern patterns and the emerging forces that will shape the frontier West. Freedmen, former Confederates, Union veterans, merchants, and immigrants move through its streets. Wagons loaded with goods creak along rutted roads toward the river landing, where steamboats tie up and unload barrels, crates, and bales. In town, federal officials and local authorities argue over jurisdiction and procedure, while saloons fill with men gambling, drinking, and trading stories about violence in Indian Territory just across the water. Reeves observes these currents with the same quiet attentiveness that once kept him safe under slavery and in wartime camps. As a farmer, he must deal with merchants who extend credit on terms that often favor the store more than the customer. Bass keeps simple tallies in his head and on whatever scraps of paper he can obtain, tracking bushels, pounds, and prices so that no one can easily cheat him. When a clerk misstates a figure, Reeves corrects it calmly, demonstrating that he is not an easy mark. Word spreads that the tall, dark-skinned farmer from across the river is not only strong and reliable, but also sharp with accounts, and that combination helps him secure better terms than many men of his background receive. Work on the farm rarely ends with daylight. After sunset, Bass repairs harness, sharpens tools, and checks on restless animals whose movements can signal weather shifts or intruders. Nights bring sounds from distant roads, sometimes the steady clatter of legitimate travelers, sometimes the hurried rhythm of riders who want to avoid notice. Stories circulate about gangs that drive stolen horses through the region or move contraband liquor toward dry settlements. Reeves listens to these accounts and notes the names of streams, crossings, and campsites associated with such activity, adding them to the mental map he began assembling years earlier in Indian Territory. His knowledge of that territory remains one of his most valuable assets. Word reaches Deputy United States Marshals and other federal officers working out of Fort Smith and Van Buren that a free black farmer on the Arkansas side of the river speaks several native languages and knows backcountry trails that do not appear on standard maps. Some of these men initially hesitate to trust a guide who once lived among native communities and fled Confederate control. But practical need outweighs prejudice when they realize how poorly they understand the country they are supposed to patrol. At first, Bass guides small parties of officials, traders, or travelers into Indian Territory on an occasional basis, accepting payment that supplements his farm income. His role may involve nothing more than leading them along lesser-known routes that bypass flooded fords or dangerous stretches where ambushers like to wait. But even on these simple trips, he demonstrates an ability to read sign, anticipate weather, and choose campsites that balance concealment with access to water and grazing. Men who ride with him notice that he rarely needs to ask directions from others and that he can orient himself even after long stretches through forests or over open prairie. Over several years, those occasional guiding jobs evolve into more formal assignments for deputy marshals carrying warrants. The Western District of Arkansas holds federal responsibility for crimes committed by non-native people in Indian Territory. Yet many of the officers assigned to enforce those laws know little about the terrain or the communities they must enter. When they hire Reeves as a scout and interpreter, he brings not only geographic knowledge but also personal relationships with Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw families who respect him as someone who once lived among them with humility and loyalty. During these forays, Bass moves easily between languages and customs. In one settlement, he may sit outside a cabin speaking Cherokee with elders while they share information about suspicious strangers who passed through recently. In another, he may switch to Creek or Seminole when addressing hunters returning from the woods. When officers struggle to understand local leaders, he translates not just words but tone, indicating when a seemingly casual comment carries deeper warning or when a cautious answer hides resentment. His presence reduces misunderstanding that could otherwise turn tense meetings into violent confrontations. The territory itself remains dangerous. Bands of horse thieves, whiskey peddlers, and wanted gunmen exploit the gaps between federal authority and tribal jurisdiction. Trails wind through thick stands of timber where riders can vanish quickly, and ravines cut through open country in ways that offer cover for ambushes. Reeves walks and rides these areas with patient care, noting fresh tracks, campfire ash, and cut saplings that mark recent human activity. When he advises a party to circle wide around a particular hollow or to post extra guards at night, he does so based on subtle indicators that others might dismiss. Although he carries firearms during these journeys, his primary responsibility at this stage remains guidance and interpretation rather than arrest. He fires at game to feed traveling parties and on occasion at predators that threaten livestock or riders. These practical shots further polish a skill honed during his years among native allies, but he does not yet stand as the man who will one day step alone into outlaw camps with a stack of warrants in his pocket. Instead, he serves as a quiet support that allows less experienced officers to do their work with reduced risk. Back on his farm, family life continues to expand. Children are born, grow into chores, and learn both English and fragments of the native languages their father speaks. Bass insists on discipline, expecting work to be done thoroughly and respect to be shown to elders. At the same time, he demonstrates a steady fairness that his children will remember for the rest of their lives. Punishments are measured rather than explosive, and praise, though not lavish, comes when someone meets a difficult challenge or shows resilience after a setback. In this way, he builds a household culture where responsibility and honor carry more weight than fearful obedience. The wider community around Van Buren includes both white and black farmers, townspeople involved in trade, and laborers who work seasonal jobs on riverboats or in warehouses. Reeves moves among them with a reserved manner that avoids unnecessary conflict while also making clear that he will not accept open disrespect. When provoked by racial insults in town, he answers calmly or walks away, knowing that a physical fight in such circumstances could draw heavy legal repercussions against him no matter who initiates the violence. Yet men who see the set of his shoulders and the directness of his gaze seldom push the confrontation far. Reconstruction policies bring federal troops and officials into Arkansas, charged with enforcing new civil rights laws and supervising elections. Political meetings become heated, newspapers take strong positions, and some local white citizens respond with organized resistance that includes intimidation and nocturnal violence. Reeves, having already navigated the dangers of war and fugitive life, approaches this new volatility with the same caution he applies to the open trails of Indian Territory. He keeps his family close, avoids public displays that could attract hostile attention, and focuses on strengthening the foundation of his farm and his professional relationships. Over time, deputy marshals learn that the tall farmer near Van Buren not only knows roots and languages but also keeps his word under pressure. When he promises to meet them at a particular ferry or crossing on a certain day, he appears even if rain has turned roads into mud and swollen creeks into hazards. When confronted by armed strangers who question his presence in a settlement, he explains his role in a level voice that neither blusters nor cringes. These qualities foster trust in a line of work where betrayal or simple unreliability can cost lives. As his reputation grows, so does the complexity of the assignments he receives. Officers begin asking him not just to guide them to known locations, but to help identify the likely hideouts of specific suspects. Bass listens as they describe each case, asking practical questions about the outlaws' known associates, past routes, and preferred targets. Drawing on his memory of people and places across the territory, he suggests paths that a horse thief, bootlegger, or killer might choose if trying to avoid federal contact. Often, his suggestions lead parties to abandoned camps, concealed corrals, or cabins where recent traces confirm that fugitives passed through shortly before. The death of Judge William Story under a cloud of criticism and the eventual appointment of Isaac C. Parker as federal judge for the Western District of Arkansas occur in the background of Reeves's daily life. Newspaper talk about corruption, heavy caseloads, and the need for stricter enforcement fills local saloons and barbershops. Bass pays attention to these developments not because he seeks office or status, but because changes in the court will affect how deputy marshals operate, how often they ride into the territory, and what kind of support they receive when they return with prisoners in chains. By the mid-1870s, the pattern of Reeves's life has settled into a demanding but clear rhythm. Seasons dictate farm work, children's needs shape household routines, and guiding duties draw him regularly across the river into familiar yet still perilous country. The combination of family responsibility and frontier professionalism leaves little time for leisure. Instead of idle evenings, he spends hours maintaining equipment, planning future trips, and reviewing what he has learned from each journey so that he can refine his judgment further. Those who know him during these years see a man who rarely speaks about his past under slavery, or about the card game confrontation that pushed him into permanent flight from his former master. He does not describe whatever anger or grief those memories still cause, and he turns his strength towards steady work instead. The same endurance that once carried him through forced marches and dangerous crossings now sustains continuous hard work in service of his own land and of federal officers who depend on his guidance. Without fanfare, he is already functioning as a crucial link between rural settlements, tribal communities, and the distant authority of Washington. When deputies describe operations that end safely because they avoided an ambush, or when they return with prisoners whose trails might have been lost without sharp eyes on the ground, Reeves's name comes up more frequently. Yet he remains in official terms a civilian guide and interpreter rather than a commissioned law officer. He accepts this status without complaint, aware that events often move slowly in government, and that his best argument for greater responsibility lies not in petitions but in his record of performance. As the federal court in Fort Smith prepares to intensify its campaign against crime in Indian Territory under Judge Parker's direction, men in positions of authority begin looking for individuals who can serve as deputy United States Marshals with unusual resilience and knowledge. Among the names that experienced officers mention repeatedly is that of the quiet black farmer from near Van Buren who can ride through storms, converse with several native nations, and follow a faint track across miles of broken ground without losing patience. The years between emancipation and official appointment have turned Bass Reeves into exactly the kind of man that a hard new federal policy will require. May 10, 1875, begins with Fort Smith crowded around the brick courthouse on the bluff above the Arkansas River, where Isaac Charles Parker opens his first session as federal judge and where Bass Reeves waits in a hallway that smells of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and ink. Outside, wagons rattle over uneven streets, soldiers from the old post move between barracks and stables, and townspeople gather in knots to talk about what this new judge will do to men accused of murder in Indian Territory. Inside, deputies, lawyers, and clerks hurry through narrow corridors, arms full of papers that describe killings, robberies, and assaults committed across thousands of square miles just beyond the river. For years, the Western District of Arkansas has struggled under heavy caseloads and accusations of lax enforcement, while Indian Territory has become a refuge for horse thieves, whiskey runners, and gunmen who believe that distance and jurisdictional confusion will shield them from consequences. The federal court at Fort Smith now holds authority over a region that stretches across most of what will one day become eastern Oklahoma. Tens of thousands of square miles of forest, prairie, and rocky hills dotted with scattered farms and tribal towns. Judge Parker has arrived from Missouri with a reputation for energy and strictness, and his appointment signals that Washington expects a harsher response to frontier crime than the district has seen before. In a small office near the courtroom, United States Marshal James Fagan meets with men he plans to commission as deputy marshals. The room is plain, with a desk scarred by years of use, a stove in one corner, and walls bare except for a few notices and a map that shows major rivers and trails, without including many of the smaller paths that actually carry riders into hidden valleys and ravines. Fagan has been instructed to hire a large number of deputies, enough to project federal reach into Indian Territory in a way that previous administrations never did. He needs men who can ride hard, shoot straight, and survive weeks in hostile country. He also needs at least one man who already understands that country better than any white officer in the building. That last requirement is why Bass Reeves has been called in from his farm near Van Buren and from his work as guide and interpreter. When he steps into the office, he fills the doorway with his height and broad shoulders, wearing plain but well-kept clothing suited for riding rather than display. His hat and coat bear faint marks of weather and travel, not of idle time behind a counter. Fagin studies him with a practiced eye, measuring physical presence, calm, and the quiet confidence of someone who has survived many difficult miles. Reports from other deputies say that Reeves can converse in several native languages, knows crossings and trails that do not appear on simple maps, and has never faltered on a job no matter the conditions. Fagin outlines the situation in blunt terms. Indian Territory, he explains, is crowded with fugitives from Arkansas, Texas, and surrounding states who believe that tribal boundaries and limited federal presence give them freedom to kill, steal, and disappear. The court expects him to send deputy marshals across that river with stacks of warrants to bring back suspects accused of murder, rape, robbery, and other serious crimes. Travel will be long, weather will be harsh, and many men on those warrants will be armed and determined not to be taken. The marshal does not promise safety, only the backing of federal authority and the possibility of fees and mileage that can support a family if a deputy survives his routes. Bass listens without interrupting, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He does not ask for special treatment because of his experience, nor does he hesitate when Fagin explains that some of the men on those lists have already killed officers who tried to arrest them. The thought of confronting such outlaws does not frighten him in the way it might shake a younger man with less experience. Years in Indian Territory during the war and the decade of guiding that followed have already shown him ambush sites, dead men in ravines, and families devastated by drunken or calculated violence. To him, the idea of carrying lawful authority into that same terrain feels less like a new risk and more like a formal acceptance of dangers he has long understood. When Marshal Fagin asks whether he is willing to accept a commission as a Deputy United States Marshal, Reeves answers simply that he is ready to do the work. Formal education has never been available to him, and he knows that he cannot read the printed words on the warrants that will cross his hands. Yet his memory for names, descriptions, and places is strong, trained by years of listening to complex stories translated through several languages. He understands that he will be expected to memorize the contents of each writ before leaving Fort Smith, to match faces and details in the field without carrying a visible sheet of paper he cannot decipher. Later that morning, a group of men stands before Judge Parker in the courtroom, ready to take the oath that will make them deputy marshals. The courtroom itself is crowded with defendants, jurors, witnesses, and spectators filling benches and aisles. Light filters through tall windows, catching dust in the air. At the front, Parker sits beneath the national flag, his presence steady rather than theatrical. When the time comes, Bass Reeves moves to the rail with the others, raises his right hand, and repeats the words of the oath as they are read to him, promising to support the Constitution and faithfully discharge the duties of his office. For a man born enslaved under a system that denied him any recognized legal standing, the moment marks a sharp turn. He now carries federal authority into lands where many white men have long ignored or abused the law. As soon as the oath is complete, practical matters press in. Clerks bring over sheaves of warrants bearing names from recent grand jury sessions. Some describe killings that grew out of drunken disputes. Others detail planned robberies in which victims were shot down without warning. Reeves sits with an assistant who reads each document aloud while he listens intently, repeating names and physical descriptions until he can recall them without error. Height, build, complexion, scars, hair, and known associates all pass into his memory, along with the location and date of each alleged crime. The recitation takes time, but once finished he can recite the details back in sequence, a skill that will keep him from arresting the wrong person even when he has to make decisions quickly in isolated settlements. Before leaving Fort Smith on his first extended trip as a deputy, Bass assembles the equipment he knows he will need. 2 reliable pistols sit in holsters that he maintains carefully. A rifle rests in a scabbard on his saddle, and extra ammunition fills loops on his belt and packs. He carries handcuffs for prisoners and lengths of chain that can secure multiple men when numbers exceed the available iron restraints. A bedroll, cooking utensils, and basic medical supplies round out his personal gear. For transport, he prepares to travel with a wagon driven by a hired cook and assisted by a posseman, while he himself rides ahead or alongside on horseback, scouting routes and watching for danger. The jail yard near the courthouse provides a constant reminder of what failure to obey federal law can bring. Behind high walls and heavy doors, cells hold men awaiting trial or execution. Outside, carpenters and laborers work on the gallows that will soon make Fort Smith infamous throughout the region. Parker's first term on the bench includes many murder cases, and he shows no hesitation in pronouncing death sentences when statutes require them. News of those sentences spreads rapidly along river routes and trading paths, carried by boat crews, travelers, and letters. Reeves understands that every outlaw he seeks will have heard of the new judge and his reputation, and that some will choose to fight rather than face a trial that could end at the gallows. When he finally rides west with his first full stack of warrants, the weather is warm and the roads dusty. The wagon creaks behind him, pulled by patient mules that follow familiar traces toward river crossings. Reeves keeps his eyes moving, watching not only the path ahead but also the tree lines and rises that could hide men with rifles. The deputy knows that the first trip under a new commission carries particular risk, because he must prove himself both to his superiors and to the outlaws who will test his resolve. He intends to return with prisoners, not excuses. Crossing into Indian territory, he passes landmarks he has known since his years as a fugitive and scout. Settlements of Cherokee, Creek, and other nations come into view, each with its own patterns of houses, fields, and gathering places. Reeves greets those he recognizes with respectful directness, explaining when necessary that he now rides under federal commission. Some older men study the badge on his vest and the warrants in his pouch with wary interest, wondering how this change will affect their own dealings with non-native criminals who pass through their land. Bass makes clear that his authority applies to individuals named in the documents he carries, not to families or communities as a whole. This distinction matters in a region where collective punishment has long caused resentment. The first man he seeks under his new authority is a white settler accused of killing a neighbor during a dispute over stolen livestock and then fleeing across the river to avoid arrest by county officers. The warrant lists his approximate age, size, hair color, and a scar on one cheek, along with the name of a trading post where he was last seen. Reeves questions traders, freighters, and local residents near that post, gathering small scraps of information that might seem insignificant to others. A comment about a man who drinks heavily at a particular saloon, a mention of someone who rides a distinctive horse, or a recollection of a stranger asking directions toward a remote creek all fit into his growing picture. Over several days, the deputy follows these threads through rough country. He sleeps in short stretches, often choosing campsites that allow him to see approaching riders while remaining partly concealed among trees or rocks. The wagon stays on more established paths, moving to predetermined points where he can rejoin his small party to resupply and transfer prisoners. When he finally locates the suspect in a small cabin near a wooded hollow, the man is unshaven, armed, and sitting at a table cluttered with cards and empty bottles. Reeves approaches the cabin with controlled steps, stopping at a distance where his voice can carry clearly without placing him within easy pistol range through a window. He calls out the man's full name, announces his own title, and orders him to step outside unarmed. The fugitive responds with curses and a shout that no officer from Arkansas has any authority in this place. Bass does not answer insult with insult. Instead, he repeats the order, naming the county and the victim whose death brought the warrant. When the man appears in the doorway with a pistol at his side, Reeves keeps his own weapon pointed steadily, warning that any move toward the gun will bring an immediate shot. The standoff lasts long enough for dust to settle on the yard and for the sound of distant birds to fade. The wanted man studies the deputy's posture and expression, trying to decide whether this lawman might hesitate if he lunges or fires first. What he sees gives him little comfort. Bass stands balanced, eyes fixed on the other man's hands, not on his face, ready to react to any sudden movement. Years of handling weapons under stress have taught him that talking will seldom deflect a determined killer, but steady pressure can break the nerve of someone whose courage comes mainly from drink or bluster. Finally, the fugitive lets the pistol sag away from his grip and raises his empty hands. Reeves moves in carefully, disarms him, and applies handcuffs before bringing him to the wagon. The arrest does not make headlines, and the man's name will not echo in tales about famous outlaws. Yet for Bass, the encounter confirms that his methodical approach in the field works as well under formal commission as it did when he was a guide. He does not rely on sudden violence when patience and clear instructions can secure a surrender, but he keeps lethal force ready when needed. On the same journey, he serves several additional warrants, some involving suspects who go quietly and others who require brief struggles before they submit. At one settlement, he finds two brothers wanted for robbery staying in a crowded house with relatives. Rather than rush in and risk a shootout that could injure bystanders, Reeves waits until night, observes who leaves to check livestock or fetch water, and chooses a moment when each brother steps outside separately. He seizes them one at a time, restraining each before the other can interfere. By morning, both sit chained to the wagon while the household inside still adjusts to the shock of seeing a law officer dismantle their sense of sanctuary without firing a shot. When Reeves eventually returns to Fort Smith from this first extended tour, the wagon carries several prisoners secured along the chain, their ankles and wrists sore from days of restrained travel. Dust coats their clothing and faces, and the smell of sweat and fear hangs around them. Townspeople watch as the small procession rolls through the streets toward the jail yard, noting that the new deputy who left with a stack of warrants has come back with living proof that federal authority has reached deeper into Indian territory than before. For outlaws who hear about this journey in saloons and camps, the message is clear. A new kind of lawman is riding the trails, one who speaks their languages, knows their hiding places, and does not turn back at the first sign of resistance. Inside the courthouse, clerks record each arrest and process prisoners into the cells awaiting trial. Fees are calculated, mileage noted, and official reports prepared. Marshal quietly observes the results, seeing in the list of names and charges confirmation that his judgment about Reeves was sound. Judge Parker, faced with ever-growing dockets, recognizes that deputies who can bring in multiple defendants from a single trip are essential to any attempt at restoring order over such a wide jurisdiction. Neither man offers effusive praise. Both simply assign Bass new warrants, expecting him to repeat and expand on his early success. For Reeves, the transition from farmer and guide to permanent federal lawman now feels complete. His farm and family near Van Buren remain central to his life, but his primary duty has shifted to the long rides, tense confrontations, and careful planning that come with carrying a badge into some of the most dangerous country in the region. He has proven that he can bring suspects back alive under difficult conditions. In the years ahead, he will also face men who refuse to yield, drawing pistols with the intention of killing him rather than standing before Judge Parker. The way he handles those future fights will shape his reputation among both law officers and outlaws, turning his name into one spoken with respect, resentment, or fear on trails and in taverns across Indian Territory. December 20th, 1878, brings cold air and low clouds over the Cherokee Nation as Bass Reeves leads a small detail away from Fort Smith with a fresh warrant bearing the name Bob Dozier. The date on the paper is recent, but the man it describes has been a problem for authorities for years, tied to robberies, stage holdups, stock theft, and killings that have left families along several trails grieving and angry. Traders, ranchers, and farmers have all reported losses when his gang passed through, and sheriffs on the state side of the line have seen suspects slip into Indian land and vanish when they try to give chase. By this time, Reeves is no longer a newly appointed deputy learning the basics of his work. He has already brought in many accused men and women from Indian Territory, some on foot and some chained to wagon beds, and his name circulates in taverns and camps where outlaws gather. Stories say that he arrives without warning, that he knows the backways around every settlement, and that he has yet to turn away from a warrant because the target seems too dangerous. When Marshal chooses someone for the difficult task of ending Dozier's long stretch of crimes, he selects the deputy whose results have proven that he can handle a man who has avoided every other officer who tried to corner him. The warrant describes Dozier as compact, agile, and quick with a gun. It mentions his role in raids on freight lines, his participation in rustling operations that moved stolen horses and cattle across several nations, and his suspected involvement in killings that took place when victims resisted. Witnesses say he changes appearance often, growing or shaving a beard, altering his style of dress and switching between horseflesh that can outrun most pursuers. He does not lead a large, stable gang. Instead, he works with different partners as opportunities arise, which makes it harder for officers to track his movements through patterns of association. Reeves listens closely as the details are read, committing them to memory before the warrant is folded and slipped into his clothing. He notes the last places where Dozier was seen, the direction he was riding, and the names of any known companions. He also recalls previous trips into that same region, remembering creek crossings, small settlements, and campsites where he has encountered both peaceful travelers and armed men with nervous eyes. The mental picture he builds includes not only geography but also the likely routes of a fugitive who understands how to use winter weather to obscure tracks. The deputy leaves Fort Smith with one posseman and a wagon driven by a cook who has worked enough details to know how to manage supplies in hostile country. They head west into raw wind that cuts through heavy coats and drives dust along the road in low, sharp gusts. Trees stand bare on many ridges, their limbs rattling when stronger bursts push through. Creeks run cold and clear, with thin sheets of ice along the edges where shade keeps the water from warming. Reeves rides slightly ahead, scanning the sides of the trail while the others maintain a steady pace behind him. News of Dozier's latest movements comes first from a Cherokee farmer whose smokehouse was emptied in the night. The man describes waking to find footprints around his yard, a cut lock, and missing meat. He also mentions seeing several riders earlier in the week taking an unusual route along a nearby ridge instead of the more direct path to the next settlement. Reeves recognizes the description of one horse, a rangy sorrel with a blaze from a previous report about Dozier's mounts. He thanks the farmer for the information, pays for the food his small party takes legitimately, and moves on without lingering. At the next town, a storekeeper recalls a customer who bought ammunition, coffee, and tobacco while keeping his hat brim low and speaking in brief replies. The storekeeper remembers the man's eyes more than his clothing, saying they moved constantly, judging the door, the windows, and the other customers. when Bass lays out the warrant information without showing the written sheet. The merchant nods slowly and admits that this matches the visitor from 2 days earlier. The direction that Ryder took after leaving the store points toward a rougher section of hills with scattered homesteads and many small draws where a man can stay out of sight for long periods. Reeves allows the wagon to fall further behind as he moves into that broken ground. He cannot risk bringing a slow, conspicuous vehicle too close to someone who is comfortable setting ambushes. His posseman rides with him for part of the approach, then remains with the wagon once it reaches a planned camp on safer terrain, ready to receive any prisoners if the arrest goes well. Bass pushes his horse along narrow paths that weave between oak and hickory, stepping carefully over exposed roots and stones slick with frost. Breath from the animal rises in steady plumes, and the deputy's gloved hands feel the constant tension of reins held ready for sudden turns. The sky above thickens as the day advances, with dark gray layers building toward a storm. Wind shifts, carrying the chill scent of moisture and distant wood smoke. Reeves reads these signs without decoration, simply noting that rain will soon complicate any attempt to follow fresh sign on the ground. He increases his pace where the trail allows, scanning for hoofprints, broken twigs, and disturbed patches of grass. In one low area near a stand of cedar, he sees tracks from several horses converging, followed by a smaller number leaving in a different direction, as if some riders parted ways. Among them is the impression of a shoe with a chipped edge he has encountered before on reports connected to Dozier. Following that track demands more focus as clouds darken. Light fades even before the sun drops fully behind the hills, and the first drops of rain begin to tap against his hat and coat. Reeves pulls his collar tight and leans slightly forward in the saddle, keeping his eyes on the ground whenever tree cover allows enough brightness to see. He knows that if heavy rain begins in earnest, it will erase most surface sign and leave him searching by guesswork instead of evidence. The urgency does not cause him to rush blindly, but it does narrow his attention to the specific indicators that can guide him to a camp or hideout before night closes in. Near dusk, he crests a low rise and sees a faint glow ahead through the trees. The light comes from a fire that someone has tried to shield behind a screen of brush, a common trick among men who want warmth without attracting distant attention. Reeves dismounts well back from the glow, ties his horse where it can remain quiet, and approaches on foot, placing each boot carefully to avoid snapping twigs that could carry sound. Rain intensifies into a steady fall that patters on leaves and ground cover, masking some noise but also making footing less secure. From the edge of the trees, he studies the camp. A rough shelter of canvas and cut limbs leans against a rock outcrop with 2 horses tied to a nearby sapling line, heads down against the rain. Under the shelter, a man sits with a blanket around his shoulders, cleaning a revolver by the shifting light of the fire. Another bedroll lies to one side, empty at the moment, which suggests that a second man is either on watch somewhere nearby or has ridden out temporarily. The seated figures build. The set of his shoulders and the movements of his hands match the descriptions Reeves has memorized. Even at this distance, the deputy can see the scar that runs from the corner of the man's mouth toward his cheek. Bass weighs his options in those few seconds. Advancing to attempt an arrest at this range, alone, in failing light and rain, carries significant risk. Waiting for his posseman and the wagon would mean losing the advantage of surprise and possibly allowing Dozier to move again once the weather shifts. The missing second man could return at any moment, changing the balance of numbers. Reeves has faced similar choices in other cases and knows that hesitation can be as dangerous as recklessness. He decides that the best chance to end Dozier's crimes lies in confronting him immediately, relying on his own marksmanship and discipline. Stepping from the trees into the open, Reeves calls the outlaw by name in a clear, level voice that carries over the sound of the rain. He identifies himself as a deputy United States Marshal and orders Dozier to raise his hands and move away from the gun in his lap. The man under the shelter snaps his head up, eyes blazing above the shadowed lower part of his face. For an instant he freezes, taking in the sight of a tall lawman standing alone with a rifle held ready. Then his shoulders tense, and his right hand starts to move toward the revolver that is still partly disassembled on the blanket. The motion is enough. Reeves has already aligned his sights on the man's upper body, accounting for distance, dim light, and the way rain can alter a shot's path. He fires once, the report loud but muffled by the storm and the enclosing trees. The bullet strikes Dozier in the chest, throwing him back against the rock and dropping him to the ground. The outlaw's hands claw briefly at the earth, then fall still. The smell of burnt powder mixes with smoke from the fire and the damp scents of wet soil and canvas. Reeves does not move immediately, aware that the second man connected to this camp could be concealed somewhere with a weapon trained on the clearing. He shifts slightly to one side, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of movement. Minutes drag by as rain continues to fall, darkening the sheriff's coat and soaking the blanket slumped over the dead man's legs. Only after he feels reasonably certain that no one else is present does Bass advance toward the shelter, rifle still at the ready. At close range, there is no doubt that the man on the ground is Bob Dozier. The scar, the facial structure, and the distinctive hands all match reports from victims and informants. Reeves checks for any remaining paperwork or identifying items, then secures the camp, unloading weapons and tying the horses where they will not bolt. He searches the immediate area for signs of another occupant, finding only an extra blanket roll and some supplies that suggest the other man left some time earlier. The glint of coins and small valuables among the gear hints at the proceeds of recent robberies. With darkness now complete and the storm still active, Bass understands that moving the body back to the wagon will take time and effort. He returns to his horse, rides back along the route he used to reach the camp, and locates his posseman and cook at the predetermined campsite. Their fire burns low under a crude shelter, and the men look up sharply when he approaches alone. Reeves tells them plainly that Dozier is dead, and that they will need to bring a wagon as close as the terrain allows to recover the body. There is no boasting in his voice, only the practical description of what remains to be done. Guiding the wagon into that rough area during a nighttime storm tests the skill of both driver and animals. The trail is narrow, with sharp turns and soft spots where wheels threaten to sink. Reeves rides ahead again, calling back warnings and instructions. By the time they reach the camp, the rain has eased somewhat, leaving dripping branches and patches of mud that cling to boots and wheels. Working by lantern light, the party loads Dozier's body into the wagon and secures the recovered weapons and stolen property for transport. The return to Fort Smith takes several days, with the wagon moving at a careful pace to protect both cargo and team. Along the way, residents in small settlements see the body, when Reeves allows local authorities or trusted individuals to view it for confirmation. Many recognize the face from prior encounters or from descriptions heard over the years. Some express relief that a man who once threatened their families or robbed their neighbors can no longer ride through the region. Others simply nod, acknowledging that one of the most elusive criminals in their part of the country has finally met an opponent he could not evade. When the detail arrives back at the courthouse, jail staff and deputies gather to see the remains of the man whose reputation for slipping past officers has long been a sore point among lawmen. The identification is confirmed, and official records note that Bob Dozier died while resisting arrest in Indian Territory. The recovered goods are cataloged for possible return to their owners, and the outlaws' weapons are stored or destroyed according to policy. Judge Parker receives reports on the operation along with the regular docket of active cases, and Marshal Fagan updates his tally of men on the most wanted lists. Word of Dozier's death travels quickly through taverns, trading posts, and outlaw camps. Men who once spoke of him with admiration for his daring now discuss the hard fact that he ended up on the ground beneath a stormy sky, shot down by a deputy who gave him a direct order and enforced it without hesitation. Stories about the encounter emphasize different details depending on who tells them. Some focus on the lone figure of Reeves stepping out of the trees in the rain. Others highlight the careful tracking that brought him to the camp just in time, before weather could erase the trail. All agree on one point. A man who had long escaped local sheriffs and Texas officers fell when confronted by the deputy from Fort Smith whose persistence matched his own. For Bass, the episode is one more job completed according to his oath, significant in its danger but not treated as a personal triumph. He files his report, collects the fees due under law, and prepares for the next assignment. Yet the practical way he handles his duties does not prevent others from regarding this particular case as proof that he can end even the longest outlaw career when given a lawful reason to do so. Among law officers, his standing rises further, and some who once doubted that a black deputy could control hardened white criminals now admit that results on the ground leave little room for prejudice. Among outlaws, the message reaches even deeper. Men who plan raids, robberies, or ambushes in Indian territory now have to account for the possibility that the next badge they see will sit on the chest of a deputy who can follow them across miles of rough ground, who does not scare easily, and who has shown that he will fire when the time for talk is over. That knowledge adds a new layer of tension to every whispered conversation in dim saloons and to every gathering around remote campfires where plans for the next crime are laid. The killing of Bob Dozier marks not just the end of one man's crimes, but a turning point in how the toughest fugitives measure the threat posed by the lawman named Bass Reeves. June 15, 1880, breaks hot and bright over Fort Smith as Bass Reeves checks the cinch on his bay horse and listens while a court clerk reads out the names on a fresh pack of warrants that will send him into Indian territory for weeks. The list includes murder, robbery, assault, and whiskey trafficking cases scattered across Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw lands. Some names belong to men already whispered about in saloons as quick with a pistol and slow to surrender. Others are lesser figures, drifters who stabbed someone in a card game or held up a traveler on a lonely road. To the federal court, each name represents another test of whether law has any reach west of the river. By this point in his career, Reeves has become one of Marshal Fagan's most relied-upon deputies for long circuits through the territory. His previous trips have brought back strings of prisoners on chains, men from different races and backgrounds who share only the fact that a federal grand jury has indicted them. Clerks have started to notice that whenever his name appears on the return for a warrant, the status line often reads "arrested" instead of "not found." That pattern has not come from chance. It has come from thousands of miles in the saddle, countless questions asked in dusty settlements, and repeated confrontations where hesitation would have ended his life. The warrants on this particular day include several for a man named Jim Webb, accused of killing Thomas Bruce and committing other violent crimes near the Chickasaw Nation. Witnesses describe Webb as sharp, mean when drinking, and as someone who laughs at talk of Fort Smith and its gallows. He has already slipped away from one attempt at capture by local officers, ducking into rough country where they refuse to follow. Reeves commits the physical description and the known associates to memory while the clerk reads, then asks pointed questions about the last confirmed sighting. Each detail, no matter how small, becomes a piece he can fit into the larger picture of Webb's habits and favorite haunts. For this tour, Reeves travels with one posseman and a cook who drives the supply wagon. The wagon carries food, spare ammunition, chains, and camp gear, as well as extra handcuffs for the prisoners they expect to collect. Bass rides slightly ahead, never letting the wagon out of his awareness, but always keeping enough distance that its creaking wheels and slower pace do not hinder sudden maneuvers. The posseman, a younger white deputy with good riding skill but less experience under fire, watches Reeves closely, trying to learn how the older lawman reads the land and the people they encounter. Crossing into Indian territory, they move first through Cherokee settlements, where houses of hewn logs stand near fields of corn and patches of garden vegetables. Reeves greets men and women at wells and store porches in their own language, asking whether certain names have passed through recently. He does not flash the warrants in public or announce who he seeks in front of every crowd. Instead, he chooses individuals he trusts, often elders or traders whose measuring gaze he has seen before, and asks them privately about riders moving through. This careful approach prevents fugitives from hearing his questions and slipping away before he can close in. When direct inquiries risk spooking a target, Reeves uses disguises that show his understanding of how people let down their guard around those they underestimate. In one creek settlement on this circuit, he stashes his coat and hat with the wagon and returns to town wearing torn clothing, with old shoes and an untrimmed growth of beard that makes him look like a worn-out drifter. He leans on a stick, walks with a slight shuffle, and approaches the yard of a house where two men on his warrant list are said to be staying. The woman of the house comes out, eyeing this apparent vagrant with suspicion. Reeves mutters that he has not eaten in a full day and asks whether she can spare some food. His voice carries a weary tone instead of the steady command that usually marks it. Suspicion softens into practical pity. She calls the two men to bring him a plate, and while they stand nearby, Reeves listens as they joke about deputies who never travel this far from Fort Smith. One comments that the last marshal who tried to reach this settlement turned back when rain flooded a creek crossing. The other laughs that any officer who does make it this far will find nothing but tired men and empty pockets. After sharing the meal slowly and drawing them into more conversation, Reeves decides the time is right. He sets the plate down, straightens his back, and lets the lazy shuffle fall from his posture. With one smooth motion, he pulls his pistols, levels them at the two men, and speaks in a clear, firm voice that bears no resemblance to the beggar they thought they were feeding. He recites their full names, cites the charges, and orders them to raise their hands. The sudden transformation breaks their composure. One reaches instinctively toward a gun at his belt, but the deputy's unwavering aim stops him. Recognizing that they have been tricked by someone who stood within arm's reach while concealing that level of control, both men surrender. Throughout the early 1880s, incidents like this become increasingly common in Reeves's work. Sometimes he dresses as a cowboy looking for a job, sometimes as a prosperous cattle buyer, and sometimes as a simple farmer searching for lost stock. Each disguise relies less on costumes than on his ability to adopt the mannerisms, speech patterns, and attitudes that fit the role. He never turns these ruses into games. For him, they are tools as practical as his rifle, used only when a direct approach would cause needless bloodshed. The confrontation with Jim Webb, however, leaves little space for tricks. After several false leads, Reeves hears reliable word that Webb has been seen at a ranch house not far from the line of the Chickasaw Nation, riding with a small group of men who drift between gambling halls, saloons, and informal roadhouses where stolen stock can be traded quietly. The deputy plans his approach carefully, choosing a route that allows him to reach the area without drawing attention. He leaves the wagon and possemen at a considerable distance, instructing them to wait at a protected camp until they hear from him or until a certain number of days have passed. Riding alone, he moves through low hills covered with scrub and patches of blackjack oak. The air hangs heavy with heat, and insects rise in small clouds from damp ground near creeks. Rocks protrude from the soil in uneven rows that can trip a horse hitting them at the wrong angle. Reeves keeps his mount at a measured pace, scanning not only for tracks leading toward the ranch but also for signs of lookouts posted along the approach. Jim Webb has escaped the law before, and a man like that tends to favor early warning over blind confidence. As he nears the property in question, Bass dismounts and leads his horse the last stretch using a shallow draw for cover. He hears voices ahead, the loose rise and fall of men talking near a house yard. When he reaches a point where he can see, he spots Webb standing near a fence with another man, both armed, both relaxed enough to suggest they do not expect immediate trouble. Reeves studies their positions, the distance between them, and the relative location of cover he could use if gunfire starts. Stepping into view, he calls out Jim Webb's full name and declares his authority as a deputy United States Marshal. He announces that he holds a warrant for Webb's arrest on murder and other charges and orders him to submit. For a moment, Webb looks stunned that a lawman has walked straight into his circle without any visible backup. Then his lips curl in a hard smile and he pulls his pistol in one rapid motion, aiming directly at Reeves. The outlaw fires. The bullet slices through the air so close that it knocks the brim of the deputy's hat from his head, tearing the band and sending the hat spinning to the ground. Dust jumps where it lands. To many men, that near miss would cause a flinch or a stumble. Reeves shows neither. In the space between Webb's first shot and any chance at a second, he returns fire with precise aim. The round from his pistol strikes Webb squarely, driving him back and dropping him onto the packed earth of the yard. The second man reaches for his own weapon but freezes when he sees the unwavering barrel pointing at him while Webb lies motionless at his feet. Reeves keeps the living man covered while he moves carefully to disarm him. He kicks the fallen outlaw's pistol out of reach and checks for any sign that Webb might still be capable of firing. The wound is devastating. The life that powered the man's earlier defiance has already faded. The deputy gives the surviving companion a choice between immediate resistance, which will end in death, and a trip in chains to Fort Smith, where the court will decide his fate. Faced with the proof of what defiance brings in this yard, the man yields. News of the fight with Webb spreads quickly once Reeves brings the surviving prisoner back across the river. Other deputies hear about the hat shot from his head, about the calm response that followed, and about the single deadly return shot. Some, still adjusting to the idea of a black deputy holding such authority and skill, shake their heads in grudging respect. Townspeople tell the story in taverns, each retelling adding small flourishes. But the core facts remain constant. A man who had killed without scruple and mocked the reach of the Fort Smith court fell when the deputy from Arkansas walked into his yard alone and refused to break. The confrontation does more than settle one set of murder charges. It reinforces the sense among fugitives that Reeves cannot be rattled. Outlaws at card tables now mention his name as they talk about whether to cross certain rivers or visit particular settlements. Some decide that any route likely to bring them into his path is not worth the risk. Others vow loudly that they will shoot him on sight if he ever rides into their camp. Yet when those same men later see him for the first time, many find themselves hesitating because the reputation that travels ahead of him has already worked on their nerves. During this same period, the deputy's arrest totals continue to mount. On some circuits, he returns with half a dozen felons secured to a single chain between the wagon and the riders. On others, he brings in even more, stacking them on benches or on the wagon floor when space runs short. Nights on the trail with such loads are tense. Each prisoner watches for any sign of weakness in the escort, any moment when fatigue or inattention might give him a chance to bolt or to seize a weapon. Reeves anticipates these possibilities by rotating watches, checking chains personally, and positioning himself where he can respond instantly to trouble. The brutality of conditions during these transports takes a toll on everyone involved. Prisoners trudge through rain that soaks their clothing and chills them even when fires are lit at camp. Dust from dry stretches cakes on their faces and settles into the creases of their shackles, rubbing skin raw. Some beg for a chance to ride for a time, claiming illness or injuries. Reeves listens, evaluates, and sometimes allows temporary adjustments when it does not compromise security. At other times, he denies requests when he judges them to be ploys aimed at creating confusion. His decisions may be firm, but they are never careless. Throughout these demanding years, a notable pattern holds. Accounts from other deputies, guards, and former prisoners consistently observe that despite countless close calls, Reeves does not suffer gunshot wounds from enemy fire. Bullets tear his hat, rip his clothing, and crack the wood of saddles and wagon boards, yet none bury themselves in his body. This fact does not turn him careless. If anything, it makes him tighten his standards further, aware that each new circuit brings additional chances for luck to run out. He refuses to rely on fortune. He relies instead on discipline, constant alertness, and an unshakable willingness to shoot first when the law and circumstances justify it. As the early 1880s progress, the deputy's roots expand beyond Fort Smith. Marshal Fagan and his successors assign him to work out of other points such as Paris, Texas, when necessary, so that he can cover southern portions of the territory more efficiently. Wherever he starts, his approach remains consistent. He travels light enough to move quickly, yet with enough supplies to support days of pursuit. He questions a broad range of people, from farmers and ranchers to saloon keepers and tribal law officers, always careful to distinguish between those who cooperate with the court and those who might betray his presence to targets. The environment he moves through reflects the broader strains of a region in transition. Railroads begin to creep closer, bringing more settlers and more opportunities for theft and violence. Cattle trails shift with markets, drawing cowboys and camp followers through towns, whose lawmen sometimes lack the will to control them. Tribal governments struggle to maintain authority in the face of growing federal pressure, with internal disputes occasionally spilling into open friction. Reeves navigates these tensions with the same steadiness he applies to individual arrests. He does not comment publicly on politics, but he pays close attention to how changes in power affect his ability to track and seize suspects. Families in remote cabins grow familiar with his visits. Some welcome him as a barrier between them and roving bands of thieves or drunk gunmen. Others fear that his presence will bring retribution from outlaws who consider anyone who talks to a deputy an enemy. Reeves recognizes the risk his work creates for ordinary settlers. Whenever possible, he avoids staying in one house for long, preferring to camp a short distance away rather than put hosts in unnecessary danger. He gathers information quickly and moves on, leaving only the memory of a tall lawman who asked clear questions and rode out with purpose. By the close of this stretch of years, the number of major outlaws who believe they can treat the territory as a safe refuge has begun to shrink. Some have died in confrontations with Reeves or other deputies. Others serve long sentences in distant prisons. Still others change their habits, choosing lower-level crimes or abandoning certain routes entirely to avoid crossing paths with the deputy marshal, whose unbroken string of successful captures has become a central part of frontier talk. The cumulative effect of his relentless rounds does not wipe out crime, but it changes calculations in many outlaw camps. Reeves himself returns to Fort Smith and other court points between circuits, always for less time than his family would like. Each arrival brings reports to the marshal's office, processing of prisoners, and brief nights in a real bed before the next list of warrants comes down from the judge. His body bears the marks of constant travel, from calloused hands to the stiffness that comes after long hours in the saddle. Yet his stride remains firm. His mind, honed by years of tracking and interrogation, stays sharp, ready to match new names to old patterns. Every successful arrest reinforces the central truth of his work in these years. On the trails and in the settlements of Indian Territory, Bass Reeves serves as a moving line of law that does not retreat once it has been drawn. April 9, 1884 finds Deputy United States Marshal Bass Reeves in camp near a Chickasaw settlement south of the Canadian River, sharing a rough fire circle with posseman Floyd Wilson, trail cook William Leach, and guard John Brady as they prepare for another day of searching for wanted men. The ground around them is uneven, scattered with stones and scrub, and the nearest stand of timber breaks the wind only slightly. Their horses are picketed a short distance away on thin grass that clings to dry soil. The smell of coffee and frying meat hangs in the air while dawn light slowly thins the shadows between tree trunks. This is not the first camp like this that Reeves has shared with these men, but the morning will end in a way none of them expect. The detail has left Fort Smith only days earlier with warrants for revenue violators and other suspects known to be moving between small towns and ranches in the Chickasaw Nation. Reeves leads the way as usual, choosing routes that bring them near likely hiding places while avoiding obvious ambush points. Wilson, experienced and steady, handles many of the day-to-day tasks of keeping the small party organized. Brady serves as additional security when they must guard prisoners or approach tense settlements. Leach manages food and camp arrangements, making sure that men who spend hours in the saddle do not ride hungry. Everyone in the group understands his role, and on this morning there is no sign that the structure of the posse is fraying. Arguments, however, can flare in any camp where men live hard and sleep little. Later witnesses will disagree about how the trouble begins. Some accounts say that Leach owns a dog that follows the party, moving hopefully around the cooking area whenever meat appears. According to this version, the animal noses into food set aside for Reeves, who reacts sharply, striking the dog away. Harsh words follow between deputy and cook, turning a small annoyance into a heated exchange. Other testimony insists that the dispute centers instead on the handling of a rifle with a stubborn cartridge, with no mention of an animal at all. What all sources agree on is that by mid-morning tension between Reeves and Leach has risen enough that other men in camp notice. What happens in the next few moments will be reconstructed in courtrooms and discussed in newspapers. But on the ground it unfolds quickly. Reeves holds a rifle that he says has jammed while he was attempting to unload or clear it. Leach stands nearby, close enough that any sudden discharge could strike him. Brady later testifies that the two men have been arguing and that Reeves appears angry. The deputy will later swear under oath that he did not intend to shoot the cook and that the gun fired accidentally when the cartridge finally released. The only certainty is that the weapon discharges, the report echoing through the camp and into the trees. The bullet strikes William Leach, tearing into his body, with force that leaves no doubt about the seriousness of the wound. He collapses on the rough ground, and whatever words were being exchanged a moment earlier fall silent. Wilson and Brady rush toward him, stunned that a man who had spent so many trips filling plates and tending fires now lies bleeding in the dirt. Reeves, trained by countless gun encounters to react immediately to any shot, must master the instinct to search for external attackers and face the fact that his own weapon has caused the damage. He moves to assist, but there is little any of them can do in the field beyond attempting to staunch the flow and keep Leach breathing long enough to reach help. They transport the wounded cook as carefully as conditions allow, improvising supports in the wagon and adjusting their pace to reduce jolts. The journey is rough despite their efforts. Every rut in the track and every rock under a wheel sends pain through the injured man's body. He holds on for a time, conscious enough to speak briefly with those around him, but his strength fades as the hours pass. At last, somewhere along the route back toward more settled ground, he dies from the wound. A familiar voice that once called men to meals and joked with them around the fire falls permanently silent. When law officers kill in the line of duty, their actions usually take place in settings where the threat is obvious and documented. Here, the circumstances are muddied by previous argument and by the victim's unarmed status. The death of William Leach cannot be treated as a simple accident without review. Reports move back to Fort Smith and into the hands of officials who have worked alongside Reeves for years. Some know him as a man who has taken extreme risks to bring prisoners in alive when he could legally have opened fire sooner. Others focus on the fact that a member of his own party has died from a shot fired out of combat. Investigators gather statements from Wilson, Brady, and others who can speak to conditions in the camp. Their recollections do not match perfectly. Human memory, especially under stress, rarely aligns neatly. One man recalls raised voices and harsh gestures, another notes only the mechanical problem with the rifle and the sudden discharge. Questions arise about whether Reeves had time to cool down before handling the weapon, whether he kept the muzzle pointed safely away from others, and whether any threat justified having the rifle in that position at all. The deputy answers inquiries as directly as he can, repeating that he did not intend to kill Leach and that the round went off when he tried to clear a jam. For a time, the case moves slowly through the federal system. The Western District of Arkansas already handles a heavy load of murders and assaults committed in Indian Territory, and officials must decide how to classify this shooting. Reeves continues working as a deputy while the legal process grinds forward, serving warrants and escorting prisoners, even as he waits to learn whether he will face trial himself. The unresolved charge hangs over him on every trip, a reminder that the same court that relies on his skills may eventually sit in judgment on his actions. By 1887, the government decides that the incident cannot remain an internal matter. A formal indictment is drawn up, charging Bass Reeves with murder in the death of William Leach. The man who has spent more than a decade delivering defendants to the Fort Smith courthouse now finds his own name listed as a defendant in United States versus Bass Reeves. Newspapers note the development, some with open curiosity about whether one of the most effective deputies in the territory has finally crossed a line. Others with more restrained language that emphasizes the presumption of innocence. For communities that have come to view him as a shield against violent criminals, the news is unsettling. For outlaws who fear his persistence, it is a rare piece of information that seems to suggest vulnerability. October 12, 1887 brings Reeves back to Fort Smith not as the leader of a prisoner chain, but as a man who must stand before Judge Parker and answer a capital charge. The courthouse he enters is familiar, and yet suddenly altered by his new status. He has walked these corridors countless times, usually with shackled men at his side and reports in his hand. Now he moves through them with his own future at stake. The sounds are the same, the scrape of boots on wooden floors and the murmur of voices waiting for cases to be called. But each step feels heavier. He does not face this moment alone. Former United States Attorney W.H.H. Clayton, who has served as prosecutor in many cases brought by Reeves and other deputies, agrees to represent him as defense counsel. The choice surprises some observers who are used to seeing Clayton on the opposite side of the courtroom. For Clayton, the decision rests on his knowledge of Reeves's long record and his belief that the deputy deserves a thorough defense. Attorney and client meet to review testimony, reconstruct the events at the Chickasaw camp, and prepare to counter the prosecution's narrative of anger leading to deliberate shooting. When the trial session opens, the courtroom fills with spectators. Local citizens, fellow law officers, and visitors interested in the famous judge's court all crowd wooden benches. The charge carries high stakes. If the jury accepts the idea that Reeves intentionally killed Leach in anger, The deputy could face the very penalties that many of his own prisoners have received. If they believe his claim of accidental discharge during maintenance of a weapon, he may walk free but still face questions about judgment. Witnesses take the stand one by one. John Brady describes the argument he remembers between deputy and cook, his impression that tempers ran high, and the moment when the gun fired. Floyd Wilson recounts his view of the scene, emphasizing the mechanical trouble with the rifle and the suddenness of the shot. Cross-examination exposes discrepancies between their versions, not because either man lies deliberately, but because each observed from a different angle and under stress. The prosecution presses the line that Reeves, irritated or enraged, handled his firearm carelessly with fatal results. Clayton counters by highlighting his client's long experience with weapons, and his consistent record of bringing in prisoners alive when killing them would have simplified matters. Reeves himself eventually takes the stand, a rare position for a man more accustomed to speaking as a witness for the government. He answers questions in a measured tone, describing the camp layout, the problems with the cartridge, and the gun's discharge. He admits that sharp words passed between him and Leach, but insists that he did not raise the rifle with intent to shoot the cook. He explains that clearing a jam in the field sometimes requires force, and that the sudden release of a stuck round can translate into unexpected movement. The judge and jury listen intently, contrasting his calm explanations with the gravity of the charge. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Parker maintains his usual firm control of the courtroom. He rules on objections, instructs witnesses, and ensures that both prosecution and defense follow proper procedure. The same deliberate, structured approach that he brings to cases involving frontier murders and robberies applies equally to this trial. There is no sign that he intends to offer either favoritism or undue severity simply because a deputy stands at the center of the case. For Reeves, this impartiality is both reassuring and sobering. He knows that the judge has sentenced many convicted killers to death, and that friendship or familiarity has never shielded anyone from those sentences. After closing arguments, the jury withdraws to deliberate. Hours pass while they review testimony and weigh the conflicting interpretations of the shooting. The courthouse hums with restrained tension, deputies and clerks continuing their work on other matters while casting occasional glances toward the jury room door. Reeves waits without visible agitation, sitting upright, hands folded, the same posture he has shown in many previous sessions when he sat as a spectator. Inside, however, he understands that any future rides into Indian territory depend on the decision that 12 citizens will soon announce. When the jury finally returns and the foreman stands, the courtroom falls quiet. The charge is read once more and the question put. The answer comes in simple words. Not guilty. The verdict releases a pressure that has built over years. Reeves exhales slowly, not in theatrical relief but in acknowledgement that the worst legal outcome has been avoided. Clayton shakes his hand. Fellow deputies nod, some with open satisfaction, others with more cautious expressions that reflect the complicated nature of the case. Judge Parker accepts the verdict, discharges the defendant, and moves on to the next matter on his crowded docket. Acquittal does not erase every consequence. Legal fees and related expenses have strained Reeves's finances deeply. To cover costs, he ultimately sells his farm at Van Buren, parting with land that symbolized his rise from bondage to independent property holder. The loss cuts him personally, representing not only money but years of work by his family. Yet he does not retreat from his profession. Once the trial ends, he returns to duty as a deputy United States Marshal, accepting new warrants and preparing for more circuits into the same territory where Leach fell. The episode leaves a mark on how colleagues and citizens see him. Some people remain quietly uncertain about exactly what happened in the Chickasaw camp, choosing to remember that arguments preceded the shot. Others focus on the jury's decision and on the long list of criminals he has captured without incident. Among outlaws, the trial becomes one more story to discuss in saloons, often misconstrued or embellished. Some claim that the lawman nearly went to the gallows himself. Others insist that his badge protected him from consequences that an ordinary man would have faced. Whatever version they choose, they understand that the case has not ended his career. For Bass himself, the shooting and trial reinforce a lesson about the weight of every decision involving a weapon. He has carried firearms for most of his adult life, relied on them in gunfights, and seen what a single round can do to a human body. Now he has faced the law's scrutiny when a shot fired outside clear combat circumstances took the life of someone working under his command. As he saddles up for future trips, he handles his guns with the same firm control as before, but with renewed awareness that even a momentary lapse in caution or judgment can alter many lives. The court has cleared him of criminal intent. Responsibility for avoiding any similar tragedy rests squarely on his shoulders. January 5, 1890 opens with hard frost on the ground around the Fort Smith courthouse as Bass Reeves stands in a marshal's office crowded with younger deputies and listens while a clerk reads the names on yet another thick stack of warrants. The room feels tighter than in earlier years, not just because papers and ledgers pile higher on desks, but because railroads and new towns have added more people, more disputes, and more chances for violence in Indian territory. The list he hears today includes cattle thefts along new shipping points, whiskey cases tied to local option laws, assaults in fast-growing rail camps, and murders in long-settled districts where grudges have finally erupted. By this time, Reeves has worked as a deputy United States Marshal for nearly 15 years. He has served under several United States Marshals, watched court clerks come and go, and seen fresh deputies arrive from distant states with clean boots and untested nerves. Many of those younger men now look at him not simply as another colleague, but as the senior lawman whose experience can mean the difference between returning with prisoners or not returning at all. He is taller, older, and more lined in the face than when he first took the oath, yet he stands with the same steady balance, hat in hand, as he takes in the details of each warrant read aloud. The court's jurisdiction still stretches across most of Indian Territory, but the character of that region is shifting. Rail lines push deeper, carrying businessmen, laborers, speculators, and drifters. Towns grow around depots and cattle pens, with new saloons, gambling halls, and stores rising in rows along muddy streets. Tribal governments wrestle with the impact of these changes on their laws and land. Federal officials worry that every added settlement brings more opportunities for bootleggers, card sharps, and gunmen to work behind thin layers of respectability. Reeves absorbs this context without commentary. He focuses on specific names, specific places, and specific crimes because those are what he can address with the authority of his badge. The warrants in his hand on this cold morning cover several different nations. Some belong to Cherokee districts where whiskey traffickers use church socials and community gatherings as cover for illegal sales. Others name suspects in Creek and Choctaw areas where cattle disappear from winter pastures and reappear under altered brands. Still others involve fatal shootings in Chickasaw country that grow out of arguments over land leases and railroad jobs. Reeves arranges the papers by geography in his mind rather than by the clerk's numerical order, already planning a route that will allow him to move in an efficient arc instead of doubling back across the same ground. On this circuit, he again travels with a small party, a wagon for supplies and one or two possemen. Yet the relationship between him and these assistants has changed over the years. In earlier days, he sometimes rode under the direction of white deputies older than himself. Now, even when he technically serves on a detail assigned to another deputy's general area, the men beside him often defer to his judgment when the trail grows faint or the risk increases. They have heard the stories of previous confrontations and have seen the prisoners he has marched in under chains. Respect grows from that steady record more than from any formal title. Early in the year, the court sends down a set of warrants aimed at enforcing liquor restrictions that many local residents dislike. One case in particular requires a kind of resolve that differs from facing a gunman in the brush. A Baptist minister known in his community for strong sermons and public piety stands accused of selling illegal liquor from behind the shelter of his church. Witnesses say that the man has been operating quietly, providing bottles on request to trusted customers and using his reputation to deflect suspicion. The indictment carries his full name, and the warrant ordering his arrest ends up in Reeves's stack because the man lives in an area where the deputy already works other cases. Complicating the situation is the fact that this minister once baptized Reeves years earlier, when the lawman attended services during rare intervals at home. That shared history does not erase the charge or the deputy's duty, but it does mean that the arrest will test his commitment to apply the same standard to acquaintances that he applies to strangers. Some men in his position might ask the marshal to reassign the warrant to avoid personal discomfort. Reeves does not. He accepts it as he accepts the others, notes the location of the church and the parsonage, and adds them to the route he is planning. On the appointed Sunday, he arrives near the church without badge or visible weapons, wearing plain clothes that cause no stir among the worshippers gathered for the service. Hymns rise from the open windows, voices carrying over the yard where horses stand tied to rails. Reeves listens from outside as the minister delivers a sermon about upright living and obedience to divine law. There is no loud reference to the federal indictment waiting in the deputy's pocket. The man speaks as he always has, confident in his authority over the congregation seated before him. Reeves waits until the final prayer ends and people begin to file out into the yard. He steps forward where the minister cannot miss him and speaks in a level voice that only the other man and a few nearby members can hear. He addresses the preacher by full name, states his own title as Deputy United States Marshal, and informs him that he holds a warrant for his arrest on federal liquor charges. Surprise flashes across the minister's face, followed by a brief look of wounded pride. He points out that he once performed the rite of baptism for the lawman now standing before him and asks whether that bond does not count for anything. The deputy listens, then answers in simple words that friendship and past spiritual ties do not erase an indictment from a federal grand jury. He explains that questions about guilt or innocence belong to the court, not to him. His duty is to serve the warrant and deliver the defendant safely to Fort Smith. The minister hesitates, glancing toward his congregation, where people are beginning to sense that something unusual is happening between their pastor and the tall black man speaking quietly at the church entrance. After a long pause, he nods, gathers his coat, and follows Reeves toward the waiting horses. On the road back toward the court, the two men ride in near silence for many miles. The minister occasionally asks whether there is any way to settle the matter without a public trial. Reeves repeats that he cannot erase or ignore a warrant. His job is the same whether the person beside him is a stranger, a relative, or a spiritual leader. When the party reaches Fort Smith, jailers receive the preacher as they do any other prisoner. For the congregation that watched him leave under escort, the sight confirms that the deputy, who often steps into their communities, does not carry his authority selectively. The liquor case is only one example among many on this circuit. Over the next several years of the decade, Reeves works routes that begin at Fort Smith and later, after jurisdictional adjustments, at other centers. In 1893, changes in federal court organization send him for a time to work out of the Eastern District of Texas at Paris. The town sits in a region where ranching, small farming, and railroad traffic meet. From there, he rides into border areas where Texas and Indian Territory laws intersect, serving warrants on men who cross back and forth to exploit gaps in enforcement. In Paris, Reeves sometimes shares office space and camp duties with deputies who know more about Texas range politics than about the inner parts of Indian Territory. They in turn learn from him how the tribal courts operate, how local customs shape responses to federal officers, and which long-established trails provide safer passage than fresh roads cut by railroad crews. The back-and-forth exchange of knowledge helps the Marshal Service adapt to a landscape that no longer matches the patterns of 1875. Violence does not diminish simply because railroads and telegraphs have arrived. It changes form, sometimes moving from isolated ravines into crowded depots and rough boarding houses. One case from the mid-1890s begins with the discovery of a lynched black farmer in a wooded section of Choctaw country. The man's body shows signs of beating before hanging, and his house has been burned. Local tribal lawmen investigate and identify several white suspects from a nearby settlement who had resented the farmer's land lease and modest success. Because non-native defendants in serious cases fall under federal authority, the matter eventually reaches the Fort Smith court and is assigned to deputies, including Reeves. The lynching presents challenges different from those in a single suspect murder. Several men have taken part, and they trust that shared responsibility and racial attitudes will shield them from consequences. When Reeves begins asking questions in the area, some residents insist they know nothing beyond vague rumors. Others claim the farmer had enemies but refuse to name them. The deputy listens patiently to each denial, watching eyes, posture, and tone. He compares what he hears with tracks and other physical evidence near the crime scene. Gradually, through interviews with people who fear speaking openly but cannot ignore his direct questions, he pieces together the names of men who bragged about their role while drunk or who suddenly altered their behavior after the killing. Reeves does not confront the entire group at once. Instead, he works with tribal officers to arrest individuals separately, catching them at their homes or on the road when they least expect it. Under questioning and the prospect of federal prosecution, some break and provide clearer descriptions of who tied the rope, who struck blows, and who led the mob. Step by step, the deputy and his colleagues build cases that show a deliberate attack rather than an anonymous brawl. When several of the lynchers appear in Fort Smith shackled to the same chain that has carried so many other prisoners, the message to communities on both sides of the river is plain. Federal law, at least when enforced by men like Reeves and those working with him, does not always mirror local prejudices. The deputy does not preach about equality in public speeches. He lets the sight of white defendants standing before Judge Parker on charges related to the murder of a black farmer speak for itself. For families in Indian Territory who fear mob violence, the proceedings offer a rare glimpse of accountability. For those who once thought skin color would shield them from serious consequences, the sight of iron bars and a stern judge provides a new calculation. Near the middle of the decade, personal loss intrudes on the deputy's life. His wife, Jenny, who has held the household together during his long absences and raised their children amid the uncertainties of frontier justice work, dies in 1896. Reeves returns home from one of his circuits to find the house quieter than it has ever been. There is no bustle of her voice in the yard, no familiar touch arranging his belongings near the door. The children, some grown and some still young, look to him for guidance at a moment when his own grief runs deep. He manages the funeral with the same quiet steadiness he brings to his duties, stepping through necessary arrangements while holding his emotions close. The woman who shared his years of bondage, flight, early farming, and the first decades of his law career rests in the soil of the region where they built a home together. Her absence changes the tone of that home, but it does not alter his sense of obligation to the work that has supported the family and, in his view, served the larger community. When warrants come again, he saddles his horse and rides out, carrying both new papers and private sorrow. In 1897, another administrative shift moves him once more, this time to the federal court at Muskogee in Indian Territory. The change reflects both legal developments and the growing importance of that town as a regional center. Muskogee sits amid lines of travel that connect multiple nations, railroads, and river routes. From this new base, Reeves continues to cover wide areas, but his rides now begin nearer to many settlements that once lay at the far end of his circuits from Fort Smith. Working out of Muskogee, he encounters a different rhythm of cases. More disputes involve rail workers, merchants, and town-based professionals than in earlier years when remote ranches and isolated cabins dominated his routes. Yet he still tracks men into thinly settled stretches when needed, following hoofprints into creek bottoms and up rocky inclines with the same patience he showed as a younger deputy. His new superiors, familiar with his reputation, tend to give him the most difficult warrants, confident that he will either bring the named person back or provide clear evidence that the target has truly vanished. Family life adjusts in this period as well. In 1900, Reeves marries Winnie Sumter, beginning a second household after several years as a widower. The union does not erase the memory of his first marriage, but it gives him renewed support at home and fresh ties in the Muskogee community. Neighbors see him not only as a lawman who rides in and out with prisoners, but as a husband moving through town with his wife on shared errands, nodding to shopkeepers and greeting children who stare at the tall figure whose name they already know from adult conversations. By the close of the 1890s, estimates of his total arrests have climbed into the thousands. Court records, newspaper accounts, and the recollections of colleagues all point to a man who has taken more felons into custody than any other deputy working the same territory. Some sources already place the figure above 3,000. The exact count matters less to him than the pattern it represents. Case after case, circuit after circuit, he has carried out the same process. Learn the facts, ride to the scene, confront the suspect, and return with a body, living when possible and dead only when circumstances leave no lawful alternative. Younger deputies newly posted to Muskogee often seek him out before their first long rides. They ask how to tell a false trail from a real one, how to read a settlement's mood when they ride in, and how to judge whether a man who claims he will come quietly actually means it. Reeves answers, plainly. He tells them to watch hands more than faces, to listen more than they talk, and to remember that hesitation at the wrong moment can cost lives, including those of bystanders. He does not try to turn them into copies of himself. He simply passes on core practices that have kept him alive across 3 decades of dangerous work. On cold nights in Muskogee, when prisoners sit in cells waiting for escort to court or prison, guards and clerks sometimes discuss which deputy they would least like to see riding toward them if they ever chose to break the law. The name that comes up often is the same one that spreads through outlaw camps when plans are made for raids or robberies. By the end of the 1890s, the legend of Bass Reeves has taken firm shape among both sides of the law. To officers, he stands as proof that determined enforcement can reach even the most remote corners of Indian Territory. To criminals, he represents a constant, unwelcome possibility that any door opening in the night or any rider emerging on a trail will be the unshakable deputy whose work has already ended so many careers. January 22, 1903, Muskogee, Indian Territory, begins cold and gray as Deputy United States Marshal Bass Reeves walks up the steps of the federal court building and feels the familiar weight of his badge, his sidearms, and the papers in his coat, then realizes that one of the warrants inside carries the name of his own son. The building's brick walls and tall windows look no different than on any other day. and clerks move along the corridors with the same stacks of files and ledgers. But for the lawman whose work has put thousands of distant men in chains, the sight of the new document changes the meaning of every hallway he has ever walked. Muskogee in the early 1900s has grown into a busy center of rail lines, shops, churches, and offices. Streets of packed earth or loose gravel run between rows of wooden buildings with false fronts, while chimneys send thin trails of smoke into winter air. Wagons creak past storefronts that sell clothing, tools, and groceries to a mix of tribal citizens, black families, white settlers, and travelers. Telegraph poles stand at intervals along main routes, carrying wires that link the town to distant points where officials and businessmen exchange messages more quickly than in earlier decades. Reeves usually threads through this environment with straightforward purpose, ignoring distractions. On this morning, every pair of footsteps around him and every scrap of conversation reminds him that decisions he makes before leaving the courthouse will touch his family more directly than any previous case. In the Marshal's office, the routine of reading out warrants proceeds as always. A clerk recites names and charges while deputies listen, sort papers, and ask clarifying questions. Some cases involve bootleg whiskey and illegal stills. Others list robberies on lonely roads or assaults in crowded dance halls. Then comes the warrant that quiets the room. The clerk announces that Benny Reeves stands indicted for murdering his wife, Costella, after an argument in Muskogee. The document describes how neighbors heard shots, found the woman dead, and saw signs that she had tried to flee before the final bullet struck. When the charge is read, several men glance at Bass, gauging his reaction. His jaw tightens, but his posture does not sag. The deputy whose work has carried him into countless dangerous camps and saloons listens to the description of the crime without visible break in composure. Inside memories stir that courts will never see. He recalls Benny as a boy in the yard near Van Buren, struggling to lift a saddle under his father's watchful eye, and later as a restless young man in Muskogee trying to build his own household. Arguments between husband and wife do not surprise any older man who has seen hard marriages on the frontier. But the accusation that his son resolved one with gunfire leaves a heavy weight that no one else in the office can carry. Questions hang in the air for a brief moment. Another deputy might offer to take the warrant, sparing Reeves the duty of hunting his own blood. Marshal Leo Bennett, who now runs the district, waits to see whether the senior deputy will speak. Bass does not ask for reassignment. He tells the marshal that since the accused man is his son, he himself will serve the warrant to avoid any suggestion that family ties shield the defendant from normal process. The statement lands with quiet force. The idea that a father will ride out to place irons on his own child shakes even hardened officers who have seen many ugly scenes. Once formalities end and the session breaks, Reeves steps aside to review the written warrant in full. The document uses precise legal language that leaves little room for sentiment. It lists the date of the killing, the type of weapon involved, and the statements of witnesses who heard the shots. The words do not mention that the man they describe grew up in a house where his father was seldom home, because he spent weeks on the trail for the law. They do not note that the same father taught his children to stand straight, to respect others, and to avoid drunken quarrels that lead to violence. In the eyes of the court, none of that history matters. The indictment rests on evidence from a single night when a woman died and her husband fled. Before leaving Muskogee, Reeves visits his home to speak with family members who will feel the impact of what he is about to do. Faces that know his steps on the porch look at him with questions he cannot fully answer. Some relatives have already heard that Benny is wanted. Rumors travel quickly in a town where people share news at wells, stores, and churches. The deputy explains calmly that an arrest warrant exists and that law requires it to be served. He does not speculate about what led to the fatal argument between Benny and Costella. He does not promise outcomes in court. He simply states that he will bring his son in alive, and that the case will then follow the same path as all others. The decision about how to track Benny does not depend on family feeling. It follows the same calculation Reeves uses for any fugitive. He gathers information about when and where the younger man was last seen, what horse he rode, and which friends or relatives might shelter him out of loyalty or fear. He notes that Benny knows how deputies work because he grew up watching his father leave on circuits and return with prisoners. That knowledge could make him more cautious, choosing paths and hiding places that ordinary suspects might overlook. On the other hand, it could also make him understand that if his father holds the warrant, evasion will not last forever. Reports from towns and settlements around Muskogee suggest that Benny did not flee far across the region. People recall seeing a man matching his description moving along lesser-traveled roads rather than main routes. Some say he looked exhausted and anxious, riding with his shoulders hunched and his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Reeves listens to these accounts without revealing his thoughts, thanking each witness and marking the locations on the internal map that has guided him across Indian territory for decades. In his mind, he plots a likely pattern of movement based on water sources, shelter, and the tendency of guilt to circle near familiar areas rather than produce clean breaks. Once he has enough information to narrow the search, Reeves saddles his horse, checks his weapons, and rides out with one other deputy for support. The air outside town carries the bite of lingering winter, with thin ice along puddles and a pale sun that does little to soften the chill. Bare branches scratch against one another above stretches of road, and the occasional crow calls from fence posts as the riders pass. Bass sits upright in the saddle, eyes forward, face set. For observers who do not know his current assignment, he looks like any other deputy starting another circuit. Only those who hear the name on the warrant understand the additional weight on this journey. The search does not require the long weeks that some manhunts demand. Within a relatively short distance from Muskogee, Reeves closes in on a small rural area where reports place Benny more than once. Houses there stand at intervals along wagon tracks, with fields lying brown and quiet in winter. Smoke from chimneys marks occupied dwellings. Dogs bark when strangers approach, and children peer from doorways at riders passing through. Bass and his companion ask measured questions at several places, confirming that a man matching Benny's height, build, and manner has visited recently, asking for food and shelter but never staying long. At last, Reeves receives word that his son is holed up in a cabin on a modest homestead, relying on the goodwill of acquaintances who fear both the law and the shame of harboring an accused wife-killer. The deputy approaches without rushing. He has confronted many armed men at similar structures, some of whom chose to fire rather than submit. The difference here is that he knows the man inside from childhood. He knows how he stands, how he moves his hands when angry or afraid, and how his voice sounds when painted into a corner. Those memories press at the edges of his mind, but he does not let them blur his necessary focus on tactics. Stopping within calling distance of the cabin, Bass dismounts and hands his reins to the other deputy. He steps forward alone, boots crunching on frozen ground. When he reaches a point where his voice can carry clearly but where he still has room to react if gunfire erupts, he calls out Benny's full name and announces himself, not only as a deputy United States Marshal, but as the father who holds the warrant. The silence that follows stretches for long seconds. Inside, a man who has spent days glancing at doors and windows hears the voice that guided his youth now, commanding his surrender. A shutter shifts slightly. Then a reply comes from within, edged with strain. Benny asks whether his father truly intends to take him back in irons. Reeves answers that the law leaves no choice. He says that coming out peacefully will keep the matter in the court's hands rather than in the chaos of a fight. No threats about shooting follow, no emotional speeches about betrayal. The father's voice remains steady, offering a path that preserves life even if it cannot erase the crime. The door opens. Benny steps into the open air, hands visible, eyes avoiding direct contact for a moment. He looks older than his years, marked by sleepless nights and the knowledge of what he has done. Reeves watches closely for any quick movement toward a weapon, but sees none. When he orders his son to turn and place his hands where they can be bound, Benny complies. The deputy cuffs his wrists with the same practiced motions he has used on countless other prisoners, making no physical distinction based on blood. For those watching from a distance, the sight of the veteran lawman fastening irons on his own child leaves a sharp impression. The ride back to Muskogee passes mostly in silence. Benny sits apart under guard, hands secured, posture slumped. Reeves rides ahead or alongside, depending on the terrain, maintaining the same vigilance he would with any dangerous prisoner. At brief rest stops, he checks chains and watches the younger man's movements, allowing no chance for escape. Campfires at night throw light on father and son sharing the same circle for the first time in many months. But conversation remains limited. Bass asks basic questions about health and comfort, making sure that cold and hunger do not weaken Benny to the point of collapse. He does not probe motives or offer comfort that might sound like promise of leniency. Back in Muskogee, jail staff receive the new prisoner as they do others. Paperwork lists his full name, age, charge, and physical description. Guards record his arrival, assign a cell, and add the case to schedules for upcoming court sessions. For them, the event is significant but not paralyzing. They handle sons, brothers, and fathers of local families every week. What marks this instance as different is the identity of the deputy who signs the delivery record. For the first time in their memory, the line for arresting officer and immediate family head match. During the trial that follows, prosecutors lay out evidence of the killing. Neighbors testify about hearing shouting between husband and wife, then shots. They describe finding Costella's body and seeing signs that she tried to reach a door before falling. Defense counsel attempts to frame the case as a tragic quarrel rather than calculated murder. But the presence of multiple wounds and the circumstances surrounding the final shot weigh heavily against Benny. Throughout the proceedings, Bass stays away from the witness stand. His role in the case ended at the moment he delivered his son to custody. The rest falls to attorneys, jurors, and the judge. The verdict arrives after deliberation. The jury finds Benny guilty of murder. Judge William M. Springer, presiding in this phase of the Muskogee court's work, sentences him to a long term at the federal penitentiary in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The decision removes him from Indian territory and from daily contact with his family. For Reeves, the outcome represents the full completion of his duty in the case, from accepting the warrant to seeing the law deliver its judgment. There is no sign in the record that he attempts to use his reputation or relationships to alter the sentence. At Fort Leavenworth, Benny begins serving his term under the strict regimen of federal prison life. Guards enforce rigid routines of work, meals, and rest. Inmates live behind high walls and iron bars, with little contact with the outside world beyond occasional letters and approved visitors. Reports that later reach Muskogee describe him as a model prisoner who avoids trouble, follows orders, and works steadily. Over time, this behavior influences officials reviewing his case. Eventually, after years behind walls and fences, he receives a form of clemency that allows release before he dies in custody. When word comes back that Benny has been granted freedom after demonstrating good conduct, The news offers some measure of relief to those in Muskogee who remember the killing and its aftermath. Castella remains dead. Her life ended on that night in 1902. But the man who took it has lived long enough to show change inside a controlled environment. For Bass, the development confirms that delivering his son to the court did not simply destroy a life. It placed that life under a structure where discipline and reflection could alter its course. Reeves himself never uses the case to claim moral virtue in public. When people in later years ask about the hardest arrest he ever made, he acknowledges the Benny warrant without dramatizing it. He states only that a man who wears a badge must serve the law even when it cuts close to home. Those who hear this explanation understand that it reflects more than a simple slogan. The deputy who brought strangers in from distant ravines and bleak camps for 3 decades also rode out one winter day to take his own son by the arm and lead him into a cell. That act demonstrates with particular clarity why his name carried such weight in Indian Territory. Whenever men weighed the chances of running or surrendering, November 16, 1907, Muskogee, Oklahoma, begins with church bells and train whistles as news spreads that Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory have joined into a single state, while Deputy United States Marshal Bass Reeves moves through town with the awareness that this change will also bring an end to the federal commission he has carried across the region for more than 3 decades. Flags hang from storefronts, crowds gather near public buildings, and speakers mount platforms to talk about opportunity, progress, and state courts that will replace many of the federal structures that have governed life in the territory. For a man whose work has depended on those structures, the celebration carries a sharper edge. The new state government means that many criminal matters once handled by the federal court at Fort Smith or by federal judges in Indian Territory will now fall under Oklahoma jurisdiction. The Marshal's service begins reorganizing assignments, reducing the number of deputies needed to cover areas that will soon have county sheriffs and town police. Reeves receives formal notice that his long service as a Deputy United States Marshal will wind down. He is nearly 70 years old, but years in the saddle have kept him strong. When he rides through Muskogee's streets, he sits straight in the saddle, shoulders broad, eyes as alert as they were when he first took the oath under Judge Parker in 1875. Colleagues who have shared camps and prisoner chains with him talk in low tones about what he will do when federal jurisdiction shrinks. Some expect him to retire to a quiet life, perhaps tending a small patch of land or living on savings and the support of his grown children. Others doubt that a man who has spent his adult life tracking fugitives and facing armed men will find satisfaction in stillness. Reeves listens to these conversations without offering detailed plans. He knows that the badge has shaped his daily habits for a long time. Rising without a list of warrants waiting for him would mean learning an entirely new rhythm. In the months following statehood, officials in Muskogee recognize that the growing town needs a reliable city police force to handle thefts, assaults, and disturbances that state authorities alone cannot manage. The police department, still building its ranks, looks for officers who know the streets, understand the varied communities living side by side, and have proven that they can make arrests without causing unnecessary bloodshed. When they consider candidates, the name of the veteran deputy living in their midst inevitably comes up. His record of arrests in Indian Territory, his familiarity with local families, and his reputation for steadiness under pressure all argue in favor of bringing him onto the city force. An offer follows. Reeves receives an invitation to join the Muskogee Police Department as a patrolman, working regular beats inside the town limits, instead of carrying warrants out across the open territory. The position does not come with the same broad jurisdiction as his federal commission, but it offers steady pay and a way to continue serving public order. After discussing the matter with his wife Winnie and considering his age, he accepts. For him, the badge, whether federal or municipal, represents commitment to the same principle that has guided his work since 1875, that serious crimes must meet firm response. Assigned to a beat in one of Muskoge's rougher districts, Reeves begins rounds that take him past saloons, boarding houses, shops, and small homes crowded along unpaved streets. Rail workers, laborers, and travelers drift in and out of the neighborhood at all hours. At night, lantern light spills from doorways onto muddied walkways, and voices carry from dance halls and card games. Many men in the area have heard his name for years, some from direct experience as prisoners, others from stories traded in camps and work crews. Seeing him in a city uniform, badge visible on his chest, reminds them that the man who once pursued fugitives across distant hills now watches the alleys and corners where they might be tempted to cause trouble close to home. Residents soon notice that when Reeves patrols, quarrels that might otherwise spill into knife fights or shootings often cool before reaching that point. His presence in a doorway or at the end of a bar is enough to make some men lower their voices and rein in angry gestures. He issues simple instructions in a calm tone, and people who know his history understand that ignoring those instructions will bring swift, disciplined action. City records from this period later show that while he holds that assignment, reported crimes on his beat fall to almost nothing, and local talk begins to describe that district as a place where serious mischief rarely survives contact with the tall black officer on patrol. Working as a city patrolman requires a different tempo than the long circuits to Fort Smith once demanded. Instead of weeks away, Reeves now returns home after each shift, hanging his coat on the same peg near the door and setting his hat on the same shelf. Winnie prepares meals that fit around his schedule, and evenings bring the hum of domestic routines rather than the hiss of campfire kettles. Neighbors see him more often, whether tending to small repairs around the house, speaking with friends on the porch, or walking with his wife to church or shops. The constant strain of reading wild country for signs of ambush gives way to a more contained vigilance focused on alleys, back rooms, and street corners. Older residents recall times when a wagon track outside town could turn dangerous without warning, when riders spoke openly about criminal plans, and when they counted on deputy marshals more than on any other officials to put an end to violent careers. Younger citizens have grown up hearing that there once was a deputy who brought in hundreds of prisoners without receiving bullet wounds himself. Meeting that man in uniform on a city street gives those stories a human face. In conversations with new officers on the Muskogee force, Reeves shares practical advice shaped by years in Indian territory. He tells them to pay attention to how people's hands move when they are nervous, to watch the eyes of bystanders as well as suspects, and to remember that many dangerous men do not look remarkable at first glance. When rookies ask how he has remained unharmed in so many confrontations, he explains that he never points a gun unless he is ready to fire it, never relaxes his guard until a suspect is fully secured, and never assumes that a quiet street means no threat. For a time, the work suits him. The beat gives structure to his days, and the visible reduction in trouble along his route confirms that his efforts still make a difference. Yet advancing age cannot be ignored. As the first decade of the new century continues, Reeves begins to feel changes in his body that no amount of discipline can override. Fatigue settles into his muscles sooner in each shift, and stiffness lingers in his joints after walking long distances. Swelling in his lower legs and persistent discomfort hint at trouble with his kidneys, a condition physicians of the period describe as Bright's disease. Medical knowledge in Muskogee at the time offers limited treatment for such ailments. Doctors can recommend rest, changes in diet, and simple remedies, but they cannot reverse the underlying damage. When Reeves consults a local physician, the advice centers on reducing strain and avoiding exposure that could worsen his condition. The thought of stepping away from active duty does not sit easily with him. For decades, his days have begun with the question of which trail or street he must cover, not with choices about leisure. Still, he understands that a law officer who cannot move quickly or think clearly under pressure becomes a risk not only to himself but to colleagues and civilians. Gradually, he adjusts his routines. He spends more time assigning tasks to younger officers when situations allow, stepping in personally only when his presence is essential. On some days, Winnie notices that he sits longer at the table after breakfast before rising to prepare for patrol, as if measuring how much strength remains. Friends who visit remark quietly that he looks more drawn around the eyes, though his posture remains upright. Inside, he weighs his pride against the practical realities outlined by the doctor, knowing that clinging to a full workload could lead to a collapse on duty. At last, the decision cannot be postponed. Around 1909, Reeves informs his superiors in the Muskogee Police Department that his health has declined to the point where he must step down from regular patrol work. The announcement brings respectful regret from fellow officers who have come to rely on his experience and calm presence. Some urge him to stay on in an advisory capacity, offering guidance in the station even if he cannot walk the beat as before. He agrees to remain available for consultation, but the daily act of pinning on a city badge and stepping into the streets now comes to an end. Retirement from active policing does not erase his connection to the community. At home, he receives visits from former colleagues, local officials, and neighbors who stop by to ask after his health or to share news. Younger officers sometimes arrive with questions about ongoing cases, seeking his opinion on whether a certain pattern of theft suggests one suspect or another. He listens, asks pointed questions that sharpen their thinking, and occasionally offers suggestions based on the human tendencies he has observed across a lifetime of law enforcement. The visits give him a sense that his experience still matters even when his body can no longer carry him through long shifts. Family members step in to help with daily tasks that require more energy. Children and grandchildren bring food, assist with chores, and sit with him on the porch when weather allows. During these quiet hours, he speaks about the present more than the past, asking about school, work, and small disputes in town. The details of old manhunts, deadly confrontations, and chains of prisoners remain mostly in his memory, shared only in pieces when someone asks a specific question. Even then, he describes events plainly without dramatic language. For him, those episodes were part of a job that needed doing, not tales to shape for entertainment. Newspaper reporters occasionally seek him out, aware that his name still carries weight among readers who remember the era of federal gallows and far-reaching warrants. When they ask about his arrest record, he acknowledges that he has taken thousands of men into custody over the years, from murders to liquor dealers, from horse thieves to card sharpers who turned violent. He does not provide an exact total because different offices have kept records in different ways, but he agrees that the count stands well into the thousands. He also confirms that in all those years he has not carried bullet scars from enemy fire, a fact that continues to interest those who have seen younger officers fall in their first few years on the job. By early 1910, Bright's disease has advanced. Swelling, weakness, and other symptoms increase, making movement around the house more difficult. Friends who visit find him thinner, though his gaze remains clear. Winnie and other family members manage his care as best they can with the means available, adjusting pillows, preparing broths and teas, and keeping the house as comfortable as possible. Outside, Muskogee continues to grow. Trains arrive and depart, businesses open and expand, and new disputes arise that call for the attention of officers he once helped train. Inside the modest home, one of the central figures of the territory's law enforcement history lies mostly at rest. January 12, 1910, Muskogee wakes to cold weather and the ordinary sounds of a workday, But for the Reeves household, the date brings finality. Sometime that day, after a period of steady decline, Bass Reeves dies at home surrounded by family. News moves quickly through the close circles of law officers, court personnel, and townspeople who have known him. Men who served beside him on dangerous details stop by the house to pay respects. Some stand quietly near the doorway, hat in hand, recalling nights in rain and dust when his decisions kept them alive. Others speak briefly with the family, offering condolences that fall short of fully capturing their memories of the man. Local newspapers publish obituaries that summarize his long career. They note his birth in slavery, his years as a federal deputy covering Indian Territory, and his final period as a city patrolman in Muskogee. Writers emphasize the length of his service, his reputation for fairness, and the large number of prisoners he delivered to courts over the years. Some articles highlight the fact that he enforced the law on people from every background, arresting black, white, and native suspects alike when warrants required it. In a region where many officials have shown uneven standards, that record stands out. His burial takes place in or near Muskogee, in ground that holds other residents whose lives were shaped by the transition from territory to state. Records about the exact plot remain unclear in later decades, but for those who attend the funeral, the location is less important than the act of laying to rest a man who has walked such a long path. Simple markers and spoken words honor his work. There are no elaborate monuments at the time, no bands or large processions. The farewell fits his habit of doing demanding work without seeking display. In the years immediately following his death, talk about Reeves continues among those who knew him. Retired deputies tell stories about cold rides, tense arrests, and prisoner trains crossing rivers. Former prisoners who have rebuilt their lives mention that the deputy who caught them treated them firmly but did not insult them once they were in custody. Families who lived in remote cabins during the roughest years of Indian Territory remember how his presence on the trail signaled that someone in authority cared whether thieves and gunmen roamed freely. These conversations take place on porches, in barbershops, and at church gatherings, keeping his name alive in local memory even as new generations focus on other concerns. Decades later, historians and local scholars begin to look more closely at official records and oral histories from the old Western District. When they examine dockets, arrest reports, and correspondence, they repeatedly encounter the name of Bass Reeves. Patterns stand out: the volume of his arrests, the consistency with which he returned from dangerous trips, and the variety of cases he handled all mark him as a key figure in the enforcement of law across Indian Territory in the late 19th century. Books and articles emerge that place his record alongside more widely known frontier lawmen. Monuments and public honors follow in time, including statues and commemorations in towns that once saw him ride past on dusty roads. For the families whose ancestors lived under his protection or under his custody, these belated recognitions confirm what local memory has long held. The man who started life enslaved in Arkansas, fled bondage during war, learned the languages and trails of Indian Territory, and then carried a federal badge for more than 30 years before finishing his career as a city patrolman in Muskogee, contributed significantly to the shape of justice in a region that often struggled to define it. His refusal to bend warrants for friends or relatives, his willingness to face armed men without flinching, and his disciplined avoidance of unnecessary killing formed a legacy that outlaws feared and that law-abiding citizens valued, even when official histories were slow to reflect it.